Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Emily couldn't understand why Jason was so obsessed with this aquarium. They'd been living together for almost 10 years and he had never once told her he was into fish. Now the huge 600-liter tank stretched along the entire wall of the living room. There swam back and forth just two mullet, mustachioed, scaly fish, each centimeters long, 10 centimeters. At the bottom of the aquarium, my husband had set up models of sunken cities and ships, and he'd even bought imitation chests of gold. "Jason, how much money did you put into this? You always said it was expensive and a hassle to get a dog," Emily asked. Sure, Jason had a good job, but you couldn't call them rich. He was a frugal man too, and he wouldn't even let his wife spend money at beauty parlors. He said she could dye her own hair and get a manicure. Not so much, but look how beautiful everything looks. I can come from work, look at the fish, plants in my sunken city and make good decisions. I was advised to get an aquarium by Mike, my new partner. He went up dramatically after he got one, Jason replied. Jason had talked about Mike many times before, almost raving about his new acquaintance. So all he heard was Mike this, Mike that, as if he were the end of the world. Emily hadn't noticed that about her husband before. He seemed to prefer to make his own decisions. But come on, after all, it's not drinking and partying. It's a harmless hobby. But since Jason wanted this aquarium so badly, she'd endure the hassle of cleaning it, changing the water and feeding it. "Jason, I don't mind, but why is it so huge?" "The fish in it are quite small." The wife had already made peace. Emily tried to always smooth over conflicts in the family. "You know, arowanas, or dragonfish like space, they can grow very long, more than a meter. And then what to transplant them to another aquarium? No, it's traumatic for them. It is better to immediately buy one that fits," explained the husband, and also added that you cannot open the lid for a long time. And in general, you should make sure that it is tightly closed. Arowanas like to jump and can die. "Okay, I get it. I'll try to keep them happy," Emily sighed sadly. Her father was a fisherman in the village. It was through him that Emily had met Jason. She was barely 19 then. She was going to study nursing, but her mom got sick. So she never went. She worked part-time in the village as a store clerk. When her mother felt better, that day a handsome, broad-shouldered city man came in. I could tell he was not from around here. No one in the village wore fancy shoes in October. The roads weren't very good, so rubber shoes were the natural choice. And Emily peered curiously into the stranger's green, marsh-colored eyes. They were small and wide-set. The nose was slightly pushed into the face, and the chin was generously outlined. It made the customer look like a superhero from a foreign movie. "Is that you, Emily?" the guy asked with a smile. He looked to be about 25. It was only later that she learned her husband was 12 years older, just looked younger. "Let's say, what do you want?" The stranger broke the unspoken rule of not saying hello. And he was talking a little too brashly, wasn't he? And that was why Emily was wary. "Don't worry. Your father and I met on a fishing trip, and I lost to him. Now I have to buy the groceries on this list." The guy told me his name was Jason. He came from a long way away. Always thought he was a master fisherman. But Emily's father only laughed at the newfangled fishing rod and elaborate bait. So with a homemade rod, he caught much bigger and faster. He must have been very angry with that young imposter who bragged about his skills. "I'm not complaining," Jason replied evasively and calmly paid for the order. The amount was $200. He didn't even bat an eyebrow. Fine, Emily thought. You think if you've got money, everyone's going to jump on you. This Jason was obviously flirting with her. He'd suggested going to a club tonight to unwind. "I prefer to stay home and not go to a club. And you shouldn't either. The locals don't like it when the townspeople take their girls away. That's putting it mildly." Emily decided then to warn the catcher. Sure, he's nasty, thinks a lot of himself, but he did them a favor nonetheless. Father hadn't been feeling well lately. It was hard to earn a living. Her mother was suffering from memory lapses, and the situation was getting worse. Emily's father didn't ask for the bet. It was a townie who suggested it. He got what he deserved. I'm not really afraid of fights. I can stand up for myself. But if you don't like going to clubs, you can just go out tomorrow. Do you have a boyfriend? I'm sorry to ask, but I need to know what to prepare for, Jason asked. He winked at Emily again. His insistence was disconcerting. She wasn't exactly pretty, not by country standards. The boys weren't like that, and that's why they nicknamed her the bobblehead. And if she had any suitors, others immediately teased her. They said he was breathing in her navel. But it wasn't true. She's not that tall, but the 1.75 m, not a verdict. Still, when everyone around her was at least 5 to 10 centimeters shorter, it became a real problem. It was only then that she noticed Jason was at least a head taller than her. Is that why she liked him a little bit after all, despite his cocky behavior? Yeah, cocky guy, but charming. He's got a certain confidence about him. When you see him, you want to believe. He will decide everything. All the difficulties in advance will predict. And you'll be like a stone wall behind him, Emily thought. I've only had one suitor, but he's a problem, she said aloud. Emily answered truthfully. Bobby Shockett, a year younger than her, was the son of a local farmer, richer by village standards. He was a red-headed brute, 6 feet tall, and he followed her around like a rabbit. He couldn't get away. My big man, you'll wait for me. I'll be your husband, he shouted to her if anyone laid eyes on her. He beat her mercilessly. Even though he's small, he's mad, red-haired, and evil. In anger, when he was a boy, he said he'd marry her anyway. And no matter how Emily waved him away, Bobby was hooked. Strange that such an attractive girl has only one suitor. I thought I'd have to fight off a whole bunch of them. You look like a model, Jason didn't joke when he saw the tall, statuesque girl with the emerald green eyes and the long, almost black braid. He was stunned. Maybe her lips were a little chubby and her facial features a little large. But what a queen. Everything is with her, and her stature and her speech was measured with a sense of dignity. He'd never seen anyone like her before. You must be joking. You know, I've already seen some of those visiting chasers who think that only fools live in the village. Believe me, it's not. There's nothing wrong with our brains, Emily told him reproachfully. She was talking to him like a human being, and he'd fallen for cheap compliments. He'd found an ethereal beauty. Emily had been young then, and she'd never imagined that her looks could impress anyone but a stubborn, spoiled farmer's son. And yet Jason, to her surprise, found 1,001 reasons to come to the village, whether it was to go fishing with his friends, or to say he'd come for mushrooms. Bobby hated him and beat him behind the barn. Jason somehow managed to win, but Bobby didn't give up. Jason didn't give up. He befriended Emily's father, and for 2 years he visited them on various occasions. Emily, what do you think of Jason? Do you like him? The father noticed that his daughter only pretended to be annoyed by the pushy townsman, but she was happy. When he arrives, her cheeks are rosy, and she's all dreamy about something. I don't know, she really didn't know how to tell her father then, that the townsman was too secretive. Nothing is known about his family, allegedly from an orphanage, he said at first. And when he said he was hired by an old friend of his father's. Before that, he said he didn't know his parents or their acquaintances. He seemed to be a nobody. And at such a young age, to have an apartment in the city, and a 3-bedroom. That's where Jason had called Emily, letting her parents come with her. I mean, you can't leave them. They gave birth to you late. They're in poor health, but you can't leave them in the country, and it was true. Emily's father and mother had no idea that they would have children, and only when the mother was 40, the father 45, learned the happy news. Parents were crazy about their daughter, nurtured and cherished. She literally bathed in their love. Except that 2 years ago, her mother did not recognize her for the first time. Since then, the father began to give up, and the back seized, and his legs failed. Tried to hide it all. He said it healed like a dog. Only Emily could see that even just getting out of bed was difficult for the muscle bear. And then, when she was in this desperate situation, Jason just dropped out of the sky like a prince. He seems decent, offers to sign tomorrow, picks her up with her parents at the very moment when there's nowhere else to wait for help. And she likes him. maybe not in love yet, but is liking someone so much a bad start to a relationship. Jason can make her laugh, gives her gifts, compliments her. He works. No bad habits, doesn't drink. He's even taller than Emily. Sounds like the whole package. But what else is there to look for? But still, there was something faintly murky about him. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe Jason was right. Maybe men are just different. Then how could Emily's father understand him? He was all there, honest, open, loving. This one was always avoiding direct questions, and there were inconsistencies in his stories about family and work. It was unsettling, but the girl didn't know if she should share it with her father. She's all grown up. She was given a chance by fate to help her family, to thank her parents for raising her and loving her endlessly. It's a sin not to take it. "Daughter, I want to tell you something," the father began. "I know you're worried about your mother and me, but if you're not sure about Jason, you shouldn't marry him. I've got a little savings. We'll get by. We'll see." Her father was wise, realizing without saying anything that Emily wasn't entirely sure she wanted to marry a pushy townie. "Don't you like him?" she asked bluntly. "You know, I can't understand him, and that's not a good sign. I'll tell you honestly, even if you married Bobby, I'd feel better about it. Yeah, he's got some dope playing in him right now, but he'll calm down and be a normal, responsible man. There's no need to rush into it," Dad said. "Dad's right. It's not so much that I like Jason, it's that he'll solve problems. It doesn't have to be that way. When he gets here, I'll tell him not to come over anymore," Emily thought to herself. The decision seemed so clear and deliberate that Emily was sure it was the right thing to do. Of course, she would never marry Bobby. He was too much of a tease. Maybe he wasn't a bad guy in his own way, but Emily wasn't going to live with him. Let someone else put up with the antics of the local rich man's spoiled son. Jason didn't arrive until a month later and attended Emily's father's funeral. Her father's death had taken a toll on the girl. It seemed to her that the life had gone out of the house. It stood without windows, without doors, blown through the air. Even though it was only September, it was as dank as if winter had begun. One good thing was that her mother didn't realize that her beloved husband had died. Emily had asked the neighbors not to invite her to the funeral. Her mother, for some reason, thought some neighbor had died. She had forgotten she was married at all and thought she was Emily's little sister. Well, maybe God spared Mom. That's why he gave her this disease. But I have to take care of her, she thought. Jason, having learned about her grief, flew over instantly, organized everything, paid for everything. Emily was grateful to him. The decision not to commit to him seemed foolish. She couldn't afford romance. Right now, she and her mom just needed to survive, and she wasn't likely to pull it off. The money would run out. And then what? Not much in savings. "Emily, listen. Let's get married. I want to get you and your mom out of this village. Everything here will remind you of your father." Jason said it without his usual smugness. He just looked into his eyes, quietly and carefully. He'd won her over. Emily hadn't realized he could be so compassionate and sympathetic. "Jason, but that wouldn't be fair of me. You're very charming. It makes me feel good that you can solve problems and all that. But it's not like I've had time to love you yet," the girl admitted. She didn't want to start her life with deception. "But I'm already sure. I only need you," he replied. Also then did not say a word about love. But Emily did not pay attention to it, and only then remembered more and more often that the cherished "I love you" he never once said. And so it was settled. They quietly signed. Everything was honorable. Jason moved her and her mother back to the city. And Emily was thrilled that her longtime admirer had gone to the city to study to be a cop. Bobby was bound to say something nasty. And then family life began. Jason was on the road most of the time. He was weird about money. On the one hand, he paid for his mother's caregiver and even let her order cleaning services. But on the other hand, he was careful not to let his wife handle the money. It was as if he was afraid that one day she would slip away from him. He didn't trust her. Once or twice a week checked all expenses to the exact cent and did not give expensive gifts. Even once joked that gold and jewelry are given only to wives who want to give a chance to leave as soon as possible. He often told me that Eastern women demand as many gold bracelets and rings as possible to put on themselves if their husband kicks them out. "But you don't have any such plans, do you?" Jason asked once again when Emily asked for permission to pass her driver's license and drive his car, which was sitting idle most of the time anyway. After all, wasn't he home all the time? No, why would you think that? We seem to be doing fine. It just pains me not to have a baby, Emily replied. It was a subject they rarely discussed. It was painful. They lived and lived. Emily cooked, did the laundry, studied to be a nurse, and convinced her husband that everything was just like people. Even sewed her own clothes. Jason approved of any form of thrift and economy. But there were no real heart-to-heart conversations with her husband. He was growing more and more distant. More and more he said that talking to his wife was a waste of time. Emily thought that having a baby would bring them closer together. She suggested to Jason that if God didn't give her own yet, she could adopt or foster. But the spouse was very angry in response. Emily, I understand you're afraid of going crazy from idleness. Why don't you think of some feminine hobby? Or is taking care of your sick mother and me not enough for you? He asked irritably. Jason, we have a house full of people. Why can't we give happiness to some poor little kid? She cried then too. Actually, she was painfully lonely too. Her mom remembered her in rare moments of clarity, but she forgot. Jason was home 2 days a week at the most, usually less. And then he'd come home late at night and go straight to bed. He was always busy, and she felt like a waste of space in their nice apartment. If there was a child in the house, everything would change. Emily, I'm sure you'll excuse me, but I'm not a blank slate in our house. Have you gotten a checkup? Her husband asked sternly, and she immediately felt guilty, already regretting having started this conversation. Yes, I'm fine. The doctor said it would be a good idea for you to see him. Emily had told her husband about it before, but he kept dragging it out. I told you, I'm perfectly fine. Isn't my word enough for you? He almost burned her with his gaze. Look, but what makes you so sure? Do you already have a kid? Emily was beginning to think more and more her spouse really did have a son or daughter growing up somewhere. And that's why he's so relaxed about his spouse not being able to give birth. There's an heir somewhere. Whatever. I see the topic of the child has already turned into paranoia. So here's to shut it down once and for all. Remember, I do not need orphans and other nonsense. Give birth yourself or forget about children. Cut off the husband and went to bed, loudly slamming the door. Emily hadn't brought it up since then. Sometimes she thought about the fact that Jason couldn't have children, but it hurt him. That's why he's so angry. There were also thoughts that his spouse has bad genetics, and that's why he doesn't want kids, and he doesn't want to say it outright. Emily didn't know how to solve this issue yet. If her husband had a warm and close relationship, it would be possible to somehow shorten the age of 2. And after all, a man and woman are also a family. But as it happened, she was used to him, and even loved him in her own way. Jason, on the other hand, had come to see her as a free addition to the house. The admiration and adoration was gone from his eyes. If he hadn't loved her completely before, but at least he'd considered himself lucky to have her, he wasn't even jealous now. He stopped asking how she spent her time and who she socialized with. They were like these two mustachioed fish that swam past each other in a huge aquarium, not even touching against the backdrop of youth, a sunken city, ships and chests of gold. Maybe that was why the aquarium annoyed her so much. It reminded her too much of the current situation. Mom liked the aquarium. She childishly admired the mustachioed fish, looked at the details of the sunken city, columns and copies of ancient statues. We should change something. The daughter looked pale. There was a rare day when Mom offered something sensible and true. How are you feeling today? Emily asked the small, almost thin woman. All that remained of the old mom were the huge emerald eyes and the voice of the treasure she'd inherited. They remained bright, radiating kindness and light, though Mama remembered little. Her beautiful soul continued to love everything and everyone around her. And Mom's mood was almost always good. What kind of mom am I? I'm your little sister, she laughed. The intelligence that shone in her eyes turned out to be an illusion. Mommy didn't even remember who her daughter was. I'm sorry, Mommy. Emily called her by her name as she asked, and again clarified how she was feeling. Fine, can I try on your dresses? Your husband has already left. Mom wasn't very reality-oriented, but somehow she remembered when it was best to stay out of Jason's house and not annoy him. Sure, except they're big for you. Emily shook her head bitterly. It was as if her mom was drying out and shrinking in size every year. Would she leave her too? Who would she live with? With the silent fish? It's okay. I'll grow up soon and be as beautiful as you. Her mother looked at her lovingly and threw herself around her neck. The memory is gone, the love remains, Emily thought with surprise. She used to think that when people said that love was the most reliable investment of time and energy, they were just pretty words. But that's just the way it was. No one can be sure of keeping their mind, health, and wealth, but love never goes anywhere. Emily often dreamed of her daddy hugging her and thanking her for taking care of her mom. Even though it was all just in her dreams, when she woke up she felt warmth in her heart. Emily was very comforted by the thought that someday up there in heaven she would be together with loving people, and they would be young and beautiful again, and her mother would be sure to remember her. Are you beautiful now? Emily sighed sadly. She suddenly thought that she didn't have a baby. It probably because that was the role Mom was in right now. The thought seemed sacrilegious to her. No, she wouldn't rush her mom into the other world to have a real baby in her life. All in good time. Maybe when she's in her 40s she'll have someone. I mean, her parents gave birth to her late in life. What if it's a family tradition? Her mom laughed happily as she ran to measure her dress. Emily, on the other hand, remembered that Jason had left a good sum of money to call someone to help with the aquarium, clean the huge glass rectangle, replace the water in it. Not an easy task. She decided to call a housekeeper. Let someone earn money, and she would really need the help. The phone number in the ad was answered by a pleasant young woman. Yes, of course, I can help with house cleaning too. When to come over? At least now, Emily was glad that she wouldn't have to deal with the glass monster alone. Anna turned out to be a pleasant, red-haired young woman, not yet 30. She said she'd grown up in the village too, and it turned out that they were fellow countrymen. I wouldn't have thought you were the cousin of the Bobby who's been bugging me with his advances. Emily was delighted to learn that she was related to the funny little fellow who had tormented her with his love. And you shouldn't laugh. Bobby, by the way, has become a good policeman and often thinks of you. You know, he's a good man. He even helps me out with money. I couldn't raise the kids without him. Sarah said that even though she's only 20, she had to adopt her late sister's boys. What do you do if they get sucked into the water when boating to a neighboring village? Turns out Sarah lived with her parents on the opposite shore. That was why they hadn't met Emily. Come on, Sarah, it's not like I'm being mean. If you must know, my late dad used to say Bobby would be a real man someday. He even recommended we wait for him, Emily said. Emily felt embarrassed that she had unwittingly offended her countrywoman, but she couldn't help her feelings. Of course you should marry for love, Sarah sighed. That hadn't worked out for her either. So soon as her seemingly devoted fiance found out that she was adopting 3 boys of different ages, he immediately disappeared and married someone else the same year. Maybe it was for the best. Fate has saved. It was only after the wedding that I found out that he was having an affair with a lot of people, and I was so naive, believing that I was the only one he had, she added. But you have kids, and I dreamed so much, but I cannot give birth myself. Although everything seems to be normal on the female side, and my husband won't let me take anyone from the orphanage, Emily said. I guess life is like that. There's always something missing, Sarah said philosophically, and they started tinkering with the aquarium. Wow, it's so dirty, it's like it's been a year since anyone changed the water, Emily marveled. Sarah told her that she helps maintain a few aquariums at restaurants. It was in a way one of her specialties. You couldn't make much money cleaning, so she decided to learn all about aquariums. It paid well, and the hours are shorter, and she had a unique skill. Yeah, my husband only recently acquired it, I think. Maybe he just overdid it with the decorations and plants, Emily asked. Well, unless he's constantly moving them around, there could be sediment rising from the bottom, shrugged Sarah. That's the way it is. You see, those chests are constantly moving. I even laughed at him, like, isn't there real treasure in there? Emily said. Emily picked up one of the chests from the bottom of the empty tank. The fish had been placed in a small container for now, so she decided to give everything a good rinse straight from the tap. Maybe they weren't varnished, That's what makes the water cloudy then, Sarah suggested. She took one of the chests from Emily's hands and wanted to help rinse it properly. But as she rubbed it with one brush, it suddenly opened and something wrapped in foil fell out onto the table. What is it? Emily took a pair of scissors and carefully cut away the duct tape that wrapped the roll up. It turned out there were several layers wrapped at once. In front of her were clear, faceted stones. Are they diamonds? Sarah exhaled. Wait a minute. There's a jewelry store nearby. You can find out for sure. Would you like me to show you one? Emily was dumbfounded and nodded silently. And only when Sarah had already left, she thought that if they were really diamonds, it was unlikely that her assistant would return. She told herself there wasn't enough money for the kids all the time. I'm stupid. So what am I going to do now? How do I explain to my husband that one of the stones is missing? Were Emily's first thoughts. But then they were replaced by even more disturbing ones. Emily suddenly realized that Jason probably hadn't moved the chests at all. He'd swapped them for other chests. That was clever. They look like aquarium mollages. There's fake jewelry on top under the open lid, but the real thing's inside. Is that why Jason had forbidden her to help clean his stuff lately when the aquarium came up? She'd even sometimes thought he was hiding a gift for his mistress. But it was much worse than that. It turns out that her husband probably worked as a courier and transported these diamonds to some customers. That's why he flies from one country to another so often. And since he had to hide it all, it was obviously something illegal. And Emily clutched her head and flopped down on the couch, groaning. That was when the doorbell rang. Oh, good thing they opened it. I was wishing I'd gone back for the phone. I've been ringing the doorbell for about 20 minutes. I was afraid something had happened to you, Jason said. Sarah reported on the trip to the jewelry store, saying that they were indeed diamonds, and very clear ones at that. The jeweler persistently asked where she'd gotten them. Tried to write down the address. Acted suspicious. Where would such a poorly dressed woman get a stone worth as much as an apartment? How did you manage to keep your composure, not to be confused? I don't know how I would have behaved, Emily wondered. Sarah didn't bother to say how embarrassed she was that she suspected her countrywoman of not returning and keeping the jewel for herself. And I just said I was working as a maid for rich owners. They are leaving their husbands, so they want to sell it. And while the jeweler was thinking, I left, Sarah explained, and her cheeks burned with joy that she had not let her countrywoman down. Thank you. It's a good thing you don't live in our neighborhood. You know, I didn't know anything about the jewelry myself. It's so scary that my husband might be doing something illegal. I'm going to try to look into it. And please don't tell anyone, especially not Bobby. You know the police are no help in family matters, Emily blushed. She handed Sarah all the savings she had at the moment. Oh, really? You don't have to pay that much at all. But of course, I won't say anything to anyone. You can be sure of that. You know my situation. I have 3 little ones on my hands, money's tight, and I don't want to let you down. Of course, you and your husband are on your own, but be careful. Call me if you need anything. If not, I'll never bother you myself, Sarah replied. She helped to pack the diamonds back. Together they made sure that every chest at the bottom opened to reveal real treasures. Then they poured clean water into the aquarium and started the treasure guardians, as it turned out, the real ones. Sarah collected the water spilled on the floor and said goodbye to the landlady. Emily looked in on her mom. She was asleep with her daughter's dresses scattered around her room. One pink one was cradled in her arms. Apparently liked it the best. Oh, Mom, things are happening here. I don't know what to do, Emily whispered. Her mother, of course, wouldn't have been able to advise her, even if she hadn't been asleep. But Emily was still relieved that Mommy was alive and loved her. She rolled over onto her other side and continued to sleep serenely. Emily was alone with her heavy thoughts. Jason was due back in a couple days. She didn't have much time to drop everything and run away. Where to? To the old country house with a sick mom? Rent an apartment while Jason was gone? Go to the police. But first of all, there's no money for that. And she wouldn't risk selling the diamonds. Secondly, there was still some chance that Jason was a decent man. Maybe a friend asked him to keep the diamonds. What if they were family heirlooms that for some reason were dangerous to keep at home? She'd heard her husband on the phone with someone he knew recently. Bailiffs were supposed to come into the house because the company went bankrupt. Maybe he's hiding the jewelry so there's something left over for a rainy day. Yeah, they don't have the closest, warmest relationship. But that doesn't mean the husband's a criminal. There are emotionally cold people who are hard to relate to. After all, they would have lived together for so many years, and for all that time her husband has not done anything bad to her. Why would she think that about him right away? We should give it a chance to clear things up. It was too hard to leave right away. It was easier to convince herself that it wasn't really that bad. The next day in the evening, her husband called. "Hi, I'll be back early tomorrow morning. I won't be alone." "Why didn't you say earlier?" "I won't have time to cook anything for company, will I?" said Emily, upset. "Oh, don't worry about it. This isn't some business team. We're all family people, friends. So they're just spending the night at my place in a homey way, you know. They're from out of town, and we're all going to be tired. We don't want to be stuck in hotels. So just get the rooms ready. Can you sleep over one night with your mom, by the way?" Jason asked affectionately. "Sure. Well, I'll try to cook something I have time for, though," Emily promised. She wasn't too pleased that her husband wouldn't be alone. She had wanted to talk to him alone so badly, and it just so happened that he was arriving with company at that very moment. Jason didn't show up in the morning, but just in time for dinner. Two of his friends did have wives. So one brunette in a bright red dress was without her husband and didn't look married at all. "Oh, will your spouse be here later?" Emily asked her. "Maybe he will," she laughed hoarsely and glared at Jason, as if it were up to him whether or not her husband showed up. "Honey, don't mind him. Katie has a peculiar sense of humor. She and her husband just have a complicated relationship. They seem to have a child together, but she doesn't want to live in the same apartment with him." Emily's husband knew a surprising amount about this Katie's family. And even stranger was the fact that Jason had suddenly decided to gossip about someone else's family in her presence. It was unlike the normally reserved man. "Maybe my husband is doing something wrong and has too many secrets," Katie asked defiantly. She was pushing hard on the red stuff. It was evident in her complexion and agitated state. "This conversation is going in the wrong direction. Those two are just competing on the job. That's why they're fighting. Don't mind them," said the full bald man, the oldest in the company. "I try not to torture my wife with work talk. Her job is just to be beautiful and organize a comfortable home." Jason smiled. The brunette returned but remained silent. The others began to praise the homeowner's cozy home and toast it to his beautiful wife. Katie continued to stare at Jason all evening and laughed inappropriately when he talked to Emily about something. She felt uneasy. Who is that, anyway? A mistress. But why did Jason bring her home? Emily didn't understand a thing. The evening was ruined. It was a good thing the visiting nurse was entertaining her mom that evening, so at least she didn't have to worry about that tonight. "Jason, will you help me in the kitchen?" She made it clear several times that there was an urgent conversation to be had. "But you usually do just fine on your own," her husband exasperated. "Yeah, but that's not the point. I have a conversation to have with you," Emily was finally forced to admit. "Honey, you can see I'm tired. Is it something urgent? Are you giving birth right today?" Jason, for some reason, decided to hit exactly the sore spot. Even his companions and their wives stared at him in surprise. Only Katie laughed gloatingly, as if she was enjoying Emily's humiliation. "No, but it's an emergency. I'll wait for you in the kitchen." Emily stood up defiantly and walked out. No one followed her. She waited 10 minutes and suddenly heard loud exclamations in the living room. "He might die soon," shouted a full man. Emily ran out and saw Jason lying unconscious on the couch. The brunette looked at her reproachfully and said, "You're not keeping a good eye on your husband. Didn't you see that he didn't look well all evening? I can see why he doesn't look after his health." "And I didn't know anything," Emily said, confused. Emily thought he was just tired after the trip. She tried to feel for her husband's pulse, but the full-figured man pushed her away. "It's best not to touch him. The doctor will be here any minute. You don't want to finish him off." Emily tried to say she'd finished her nursing course, but the doorbell was already ringing. She ran to open it. The ambulance did indeed arrive surprisingly quickly. "It's so urgent we need to hospitalize him. Are you with us?" the doctor asked her. "Of course. I'll just give instructions to the nurse." Emily asked the nurse to stay with her mom a little longer and left some money. Already on the road, they managed to find out that they were not going to the city hospital, but to a private clinic. Don't worry, we've known Michael Matthews for a long time. He paid for everything. A free ambulance, would have been traveling for how long? And it sounds like he saved your husband's life, the doctor said, and went on to praise the guest at length. Thank him, of course, was all Emily could say. It was all wrong somehow. Her husband had gotten sick for no good reason. He didn't look sick or tired at all, and the guests were alone. The nurse hardly left Mom's room. Of course, they didn't know anything about the jewelry, but it was still kind of scary to leave strangers in the apartment. But it was too late to think about that now. It took them an hour to get to the clinic. The building was small and suspiciously shabby. Your husband has a congenital heart defect. It's very serious. We need to move him to the regional hospital, the doctor said after the examination, which took another hour. She also sternly explained that they couldn't transport him there for free. But Michael Matthews is supposed to be paying for the treatment. Emily's head was spinning with all the events. She couldn't keep up with them and didn't understand anything. Yes, and we'll put the money back into his account. In the meantime, your spouse needs to be taken to the regional. Were you ready to take him at your own expense? The doctor asked. I don't have much money. Emily pulled her wallet out of her husband's pocket. She herself hadn't even thought about money when she left, and now she was berating herself for it. Katie was right, she was a bad wife, and she was angry with her for nothing. It's not much, but it's enough. The doctor went to arrange transportation, and Emily asked permission to see her husband, but was informed that he was too weak and generally under IV, so that couldn't be arranged right now. Emily was finally convinced of her helplessness and cried with resentment. While she'd suspected Jason, she'd missed his attack. And how would she feel about losing the only person who cared about her at a time like this? What would she remember? The way she tried to poison the last hours of his life? It was very bitter, and Emily felt ungrateful and destructive. Jason may not be perfect, but he tried. He'd worked hard for her on those business trips, and she hadn't appreciated it. That's how it works. When it took another hour in the ambulance to the regional hospital, the doctors wouldn't even let her touch her husband, who never opened his eyes or said anything. Honey, I'm sorry, get well. I really need you, she whispered to him through her tears. But there was no response. And there was no money left to get a cab home. She spent the night in the hospital right in the corridor, sitting on an uncomfortable metal chair, and she had nightmares. Her husband was in a coffin at the bottom of an aquarium. His body was covered in diamonds. She cried silently. She couldn't breathe because she was underwater too. Hey, go home. In the morning, the nurse woke her up and told her that she couldn't help her husband for the time being. When he got better, she'd get a call. So will he live? That's all Emily wondered. The nurse called the doctor, who, after half an hour, confirmed that Jason had been placed in a special room and all the necessary care had been arranged. But she couldn't see him yet. The doctor promised to contact her when visits were allowed. Emily took 2 transfers to get home. When she arrived, she was literally exhausted. How's Jason? He's fine. The nurse was very happy to see her. It looks like it should be all right, Emily said. Did your guests leave last night? Emily thought that was kind of odd. But in the end, it was even better. But she didn't have the energy for hospitality at all right now. Emily and those strange people were playing with the fish. I told them they didn't like it, and no one listened to me, Thomas told her suddenly a few days later. Maybe you imagined it. Emily remembered that her mom thought of her as an older sister. I'm not. I'm an adult. They pulled out the trunks and put the others in there. And the fattest one called me a crazy old woman for some reason. Even though I explained that I was in 2nd grade and a very good girl, the mother said resentfully. Emily asked her for other details. Mom had indeed seen the guests. There was no doubt about that. She described it in great detail. Only the horrible thought of missing diamonds suddenly crept into her head. Emily pulled out the trunks, opened the bottom, and was stunned. There was nothing inside, nothing. And she knew for a fact that before the guests had come, the chests had been full of diamonds. So the guests had taken them, while she was at the hospital with her husband. We need to talk to Jason. It's very important. The doctor told her that her husband had already regained consciousness. "Yes, hello. This is Jason's wife. I need to talk to him," she yelled into the phone. "Look, I understand you're worried, but for now, the patient shouldn't be worried. It could cost him his life." The nurse said this both yesterday and the day before. Emily had already memorized those words by heart. "It really is very important. If you don't put him on the phone, I'll come over and talk to him anyway," she said in desperation. So even though she knew her husband was undergoing serious treatment, there were valuables worth a huge amount stolen. Emily had to tell him. Jason was the only one who would know what to do in this case. "I hate to say this, but someone has to help the patient survive. If you don't care about him, then it's our duty to save him. We simply won't let you in. Even if you come," the nurse said sternly, and explained that for now, doctors were still fighting for Jason's life. "I'm sorry, of course. That's the most important thing." Emily burst into tears into the phone, and the response was simply to drop the call. She wouldn't feel so guilty if she saw that Jason was actually quite awake and cheerful. "So, have you calmed down, my boar?" he said with a laugh to the brunette who was posing as a nurse and answering his phone, eager to come over to revive you with a kiss. Laughed disdainfully Katie. "You know, I'd rather you did that." He pulled her gently to him. She laughed and climbed into his lap. Jason wasn't going to die. He wasn't even sick. He had to play this whole thing out just so his guests would learn the lessons of the aquarium. The aquarium had a very expensive security alarm system, and it only went off if someone opened the bottom. Jason didn't think Emily would open the diamond boxes. He'd planned an alarm system in case one of the partners decided to sneak in and rob him. And what was his surprise when he saw on the video camera that some unfamiliar redhead and his wife had decided to get the treasure. He wasn't going to explain anything to his wife, so he came up with his cunning plan with the hospital and the guests. "And that one looked at me so funny all evening. You can see that she loves you, jealous. And by the way, she's not as ugly as you said." "Pretty cute," Katie said after the consolations were over. "Yeah, my Emily is just a redneck. Picked her up on purpose to rustle around the house and keep her quiet. There's no escape. Her mom's a freak." Jason had explained that to his mistress many times. He wasn't going to fight with Katie. It was her father, a powerful authority in the criminal world, who had once helped him transport stolen diamonds directly from the places where they were mined and sell them to interested parties. He'd also set him up as a manager to keep an eye on him, just so Jason would have an excuse to go back and forth. But of course, the main business was career work. Katie's father once sat in with his own. So when that one was put away because his tongue was too long, he decided to help his son. So he got him a cushy job after the orphanage, organized an apartment, recommended he get himself a wife to keep an eye out for, a simple one who minded her own business. Jason did just that, but he loved Emily in his own way. He couldn't even believe at first that he'd gotten such a rare beauty, the kind he'd never dreamed of. Of course, it wasn't that Jason would give his life for Emily. Rather, she was a tidbit that had just happened to fall into his lap. So only a fool would give up a faithful, decent, good-looking wife. But he wasn't going to say any of that. She kept him not only a profitable father, but also the son Ryan she'd borne him. The boy was already 4 years old. Criminal grandfather allowed to see him, but immediately warned that Ryan, with his father for the time being, will not live. "Consider my grandson a pledge of our long-term partnership," Nick Edwards grinned. Every time Jason started a conversation that he was ready to adopt the boy and even go to Katie for good, his mistress looked at ease at the fact that she hardly ever saw her own child. Katie loved the fun life. Jason suspected she wasn't the only one with him. But in the end, who cared if he were too picky? He'd be thrown out of the family or finished off like his dad. Jason knew nothing about his mother, except that she'd given birth to him in prison and had given up all her rights. When he was a kid, there was a lot of drinking and partying in the house. Eventually, his father put him in an orphanage and drank his way through the apartment, and then he died. Jason wasn't going to go down the same path. He wanted to find stability and become like Nick Edwards and live a life of peace and quiet. It's okay. He could put up with his son's powerful grandfather, but he wouldn't last forever. And if Jason does well, Nick Edwards will hand him the reins. That's when it could get really big. And if he wasn't going to leave Emily, she suited him just fine. She was a worthy piece in his collection. But if only she didn't piss him off with her fondness for the kids and didn't meddle where he didn't want her to. Jason was discreetly putting his wife on birth control, so he wasn't afraid they'd have someone. He didn't need too much in common with Emily. What if Katie demanded to leave her after all? And Jason didn't want his child growing up out there somewhere without him. Besides, he already had one. Emily was more compliant, with no kids, forced to tiptoe only in front of him. Jason was possessive and wouldn't share his wife with anyone else. But Katie was different. He didn't consider her his woman. She was just a bridge to her daddy, to his son, and to his wealth. He'd get rid of her someday. Except he'd have to wait for Nick Edwards to die first. At times, Jason even had thoughts that someday, when he'd solidified his position, that death might even somehow be hastened. But for now, it was too soon. In the meantime, while he was daydreaming about the power and wealth that would someday be his alone, they hadn't gotten a call from the aquarium owners in a couple weeks and had to make do with the usual cleaning. The rich were not very generous and extremely picky. Today, Sarah had gotten a whole rant because of a small speck of dust on the baseboard. The landlady had only paid her half the amount. Oh my God. She just has no idea what it's like for me with 3 little ones, 2-year-old Matt, his twin brother Sam, and 4-year-old Kevin. That's actually the reason Sarah got a common-law husband 6 months ago. But this Victor didn't help with the kids. And he drank all the money while he was only good for one thing. Victor inherited an apartment from his late mother. That's where Sarah and the kids lived. What was he like? He wasn't mean, he wasn't evil, but he was absolutely useless. What was there to do? Her cousin offered to go back to the village, but she'd earn even less there. And here was a chance to cure Victor of his bad habit. To marry and raise children at home. There was nothing like that for them. There was no normal house, no kindergarten. The nearest hospital was far away, and there were only 2 doctors and a nurse working there, specialists in absolutely all matters. No, she could not leave the city, at least for the sake of her children. So she put up with hard work and reproaches. Everyone has their own cross to bear. And no, I feel sorry for you. I would like to help you so much, Victor constantly told her. After all, you do not drink your salary and children's allowances, she sighed. It was no use. But she couldn't make up her mind. It was good that there was a neighbor with 2 children who helped with the kids when she was at work. And she in return also sat with her 2 little daughters. At least the neighbor had an elderly mother who could boil porridge, go shopping for groceries. But she had no one in town at all. She was already approaching the entrance of the house when suddenly 2 sturdy strangers in short leather jackets blocked her way, and they looked unfriendly. "What do you want?" she asked. At first she thought Victor had borrowed from someone again and hadn't paid back. This was happening more and more often. "If you want your babies to be okay, forget about the diamonds," the short-cropped blonde man said. But the other one, the bald one, just looked at Sarah gloomily and said nothing. Her insides went cold with dread, and there was more of this to come. How had they even found her? Had Emily given her away? "Look, I forgot all about it a long time ago, and I wasn't going to tell anyone," Sarah said, stammering. "Well, you're giving it all away," the blonde said with a smirk. "Keep in mind, if anything happens, it's the kids that get hurt first. They're glorious. It'll be a shame if they don't grow up," the bald man said and laughed so nastily that it was clear he wasn't going to spare anyone. A real thug. "We'd have to go to Bobby after all. I just can't go to the police and he'll say something." The cousin was going to be in town tomorrow. So Sarah told him she had a serious conversation with him, but she wouldn't say anything over the phone. It was just too dangerous. Wow, I didn't think fate would bring me and Emily together like this. I should take a closer look at this case. It smells dangerous. I'd even say it smells like death. Bobby told his cousin that he would try to find out everything without attracting attention. He wrote down descriptions of the 2 men and Emily's address. Sarah felt a little more at peace. Bobby's reliable after all. If he promised to do what he could, it wasn't empty words. He and he had once gone to the same high school. And Sarah knew that even as a child, Bobby was not the spoiled son of a rich farmer that everyone thought he was. Yes, he was easy on the eyes, but when it came to something serious, he always came to the rescue. and those who knew him intimately trusted him, long before he joined the police force. At the same time, Emily decided to see her husband and hoped she could somehow negotiate with security. No matter what the nurse said on the phone, the case couldn't wait. Emily felt like she was sitting on a powder keg. "I'm sorry, I don't know who you called, but we didn't have a patient like that at all." The nurse rounded her eyes at her. "Wait, but he was already brought here last night. And I talked to the doctor." Emily described the doctor. It turned out that the gray-haired, mustachioed, blue-eyed, large man had never worked here. "I'm sorry. Are you confused about something? You can talk to the superintendent." Anyone. The nurse talked to Emily like she was crazy, and the unhappy young woman talked to whoever she could. Even showed Jason's picture in case they mixed up his chart. No one had seen him here. Could he have just tricked her and run away, and his cronies stolen the diamonds? The thought suddenly flashed through her mind, and it was clear that Jason had simply tricked her into running away with the jewelry. But how did he know she'd uncovered the stash? She should call Sarah and have her call Bobby, Emily thought, and was surprised to learn that the guy she'd once been in love with was already investigating her. When they met after a long separation, she didn't even recognize the red-haired young man who had once chased her at first. Bobby had stretched out, was now much taller than her. He'd also grown up a lot. He was unrecognizable. "Emily, I'm sorry for bothering you then. I was so afraid of losing you," he'd said the first time they'd met. "Well, what can you do? I teased you too. So even." Emily smiled and noticed that the guy still blushed when he saw her. But now for some reason it wasn't annoying, it even felt good. For about a week, Bobby told her that he'd gotten a lead on a group that was smuggling illegal contraband. Then all of a sudden he stopped contacting them, just disappeared. "Sarah, we need to get the word out. Bobby's in danger, involving the police already officially, and it needs to be reported that he was investigating," Emily said. But the kids could get hurt. I told you I've been threatened." Sarah was distraught. She felt sorry for her cousin, but also worried endlessly about the fate of the babies. "Understand, you can't drag this out. My husband has run away. He clearly had something to do with it. And who's behind Jason? It's scary to think about. You know how much each diamond is worth." Emily persuaded her to act. What they didn't know was that Jason was already wanted without them. And what happened was this. Nick Edwards had been talking to Katie in the car and didn't know that Jason, who wanted to get to know his relatives better, had deliberately bugged it. At that point, he hadn't decided whether or not to finally leave Emily. And the conversation he overheard made him very uncomfortable. Katie stopped seeing the guy for a while. "Jason is far from stupid. He can see that his so-called son is very unlike him," Nick Edwards said. "Dad, come on. Jason is a self-righteous turkey, can't see further than his nose. He's sure the world revolves around him, and there's nothing he wouldn't guess," Katie objected. "I wouldn't underestimate him. Yes, he's obsessed with you, but he's not that stupid. And if he finds out he doesn't have a son, he might let himself off the hook, steal the jewelry, and then look for the wind in the field. But that's not even the point. It's that we have to find him and put him away so I don't have to worry." "Do we need all this trouble?" Nick Edwards asked. "All right, I won't hang out with the guy just yet, although it's not much fun. Jason is such an arrogant bore. But money is more important, and so is my daddy's peace of mind about Katie. That's how they decided to make a fool out of me. But no, Jason didn't wait. He was gone the same day with everything. Fake passports, just in case, and hiding places he'd prepared long before. Like they say, you get what you get what you get." Nick Edwards had taught him to always be ready to make a move. Jason's first thought was of Emily's father's fishing cabin. The cabin was in the woods near a small lake. No one would be looking for him there for sure. And that's where he kept Bobby, but he was in the basement. And even Nick Edwards didn't know where he was. Jason said he just took out the cop. That's what he was going to do. But now it was taking a different turn. We could frame Nick Edwards and plant the body on him, his daughter. And that would be a surprise. "All right, I'm in the city for now, and I'll get there in a couple days," Jason thought. He shouldn't have revealed himself right away. Surely everyone would be looking for him. True, he wasn't going to travel the roads by car. He could get there much safer by bicycle, through the woods and fields. And in the meantime, Bobby was in the basement. He also didn't remember anything. There was a dry crust of bread and some water nearby, and his hands and feet were tied, but still the food and water could be reached. He drank like a beast with his lips and bit greedily into the dry bread. His head was splitting. "Help!" he had shouted many times before, but heard only the cries of forest birds in response. He had no memory of how he had gotten here or his enemy was. There were only 2 women in front of him, one redhead with babies, the other green-eyed with long, dark hair. Bobby remembered that he had to save them, but how? From whom? And at the same time, he knew he couldn't wait, and that was very important. If Bobby had known that death would catch up with him in a couple of days, he would have thought faster, but he'd forgotten everything. The wounds were taking all his strength. He even thought he should stop trying to untie the ropes and just die quietly. He was so weak, it was the easiest and best thing to do now. That very night, when Bobby had already resigned himself to the fact that he'd stopped struggling, Emily woke up in a sweat from her own screaming. She saw her daddy's lake house that he had once built himself to go fishing. There were good spots nearby, and sometimes he even took his daughter with him. There was Bobby in the basement for some reason. In the dream, he was young again, almost a child, and he was calling out to her for help. His head was covered in blood, and on a bicycle, Death rode up to the house with a scythe. It grinned ominously, and Death looked like Jason for some reason. And Emily thought the dream looked like a dream, so she called a nurse for her mom right at night. Then she booked a cab with the last of her savings and went to her late father's house. "Mom, how did you know that?" "Daughter, you're to Daddy right." And Emily looked at her in surprise, but there was no time to question. It was the only time Mom finally remembered that Emily was her daughter, and there was no time to talk. How hurtful is that? She arrived at her dad's cabin in the morning, asked the cabbie to wait. Somehow she had no doubt when she lifted the manhole cover that Bobby would be there, and I hoped he was alive. "Who are you?" "You're the one I have to save," Bobby mumbled in his delirium. He couldn't remember who was in front of him, but he knew for sure that he had been in love with this woman for a long time, and he had to help her. "It's me, Emily. Come on, we have to get out before it's too late." And Emily cut his restraints, treated his wounds with the supplies she'd brought with her, threw her dad's raincoat over Bobby so the cab driver wouldn't notice the wounds, and drove him to her house. It was Jason's house, but he wouldn't go there now. So it was safe for now. A couple days later, Bobby's memory came back. "Emily, you need to testify right away," he said. That's before you know it. She was so scared for him. Suddenly she realized Dad was right. We should have waited for Bobby. Now he was no longer seen as an annoying young man, but as a man who would do anything for her. And back in her delirium, while she'd been courting him, he kept saying he loved her. And for some reason that memory was warming now. "Look, I remember everything I need to. The longer we drag this out, the more dangerous it is for you, for Sarah," Bobby insisted. He immediately provided the information that had both Katie and her father in custody. Details came out that clarified why no one had seen Jason at the hospital. Turns out he was brought to the off wing, and there were fake people on duty there. And there was no paid hospital where Emily had gone. There was only a sanatorium, which was closed for repairs. However, one wing was really disguised as a clinic. It all turned out to be a sham, and so had Lucy. "I'm afraid we're not going to find Jason anytime soon," Bobby said. Emily told him a prophetic dream, and the fishing cabin did indeed show signs of her husband's presence. But that was the end of it. "I'm divorcing him anyway," Emily decided. She wasn't going to stay in a bond with a man who constantly cheated on her. She wanted to get a job and rent some place to live. Bobby, on the other hand, offered to stay with him for the time being. "But the situation will be ambiguous. I heard your confession," Emily said. "Crippled you," Bobby sighed. Emily decided to see if Bobby still loved her, and for some reason she wanted to believe that he did. "I wasn't going to deny it. Yes, I did and I do, but you can't make nice by force. Live as long as you need to. I'm not calling anyone to my house. You and Sarah seem to have become friends." Bobby revealed his plans. "Well, maybe the situation is ambiguous because I like you too," Emily said cautiously. After she had saved Bobby, it had become clear to her that life was fragile and fleeting, and everything important had to be said as quickly as possible. She'd already wasted almost 10 years of her life on Jason, and this is where it all led. "Emily, look, I proposed to you a long time ago. Do you think this is how we should get married?" Bobby said in response. Emily blushed a deep red. Then he stopped talking and couldn't get over it. But a couple months after Emily and her mom moved out and Sarah and the 3 boys showed up at the cop's apartment, Bobby calmed down and even started purring songs under his breath. From that moment on, it was clear to him why he hadn't died in that basement. Now there was clearly someone to live for. No, you don't look so good. We should call an ambulance." "Your cough isn't good," Emily told Sarah another month later, and she wouldn't stop coughing. "I have chronic bronchitis. It's nothing, just a seasonal exacerbation." Sarah brushed it off. When Emily insisted and called an ambulance, the doctor immediately took Sarah to the hospital. A week later, she was gone. It was like a thunderclap. "What did you want?" "The case is very neglected. She worked for years, carried the disease on her feet." The doctor waved his hands. Emily couldn't do anything to help, but she could take care of the babies. Bobby was only too happy for them to get married and adopt the boys. Of course, he blamed himself for not convincing Sarah to move in with him sooner, but she was so stubborn. She kept hoping her common-law husband would wise up, and he didn't even show up for the funeral. Bobby tried to tell him about his sister's death. That's how he found out that he didn't grieve after he left, and immediately got a new lady. His heart didn't stop Ryan from drinking, so he was quite happy, although for the sake of appearances he offered to raise a glass for the repose of his soul. He even shed a tear, but Bobby declined. A year later, Emily's mom passed away. A month before leaving, she regained consciousness, began to recognize her daughter, happy that she was expecting a child, and was sure that the other 3 boys are also her own grandchildren. No one began to change the elderly woman's mind. "Daughter, when I am gone, you certainly do not cry. I've lived a good life. And also, go to Daddy's cottage, the one by the lake. I had a dream about my dad today. He said there's a good catch tied up under the bridge," Mom said. Emily thought she was delusional, but promised she would. They talked so much during that month it seemed like never before in their lives. Emily couldn't be happy that she had a mom again who remembered her, but they were only destined for a month of happiness. And then a mom quietly fell asleep and never woke up again. Died early in the morning with a smile on her face. "Ashley, don't cry, your mom died happy. She was excited about her grandchildren. They even remembered me and approved of me." Bobby tried to hold back the tears. He felt unbearably sorry that now that they had lived to be happy, such family and friends were gone. "I know, Bobby, but I can't help it. I once thought I didn't have a baby just because I had to take care of my mom like a little girl. Maybe it's my fault she's dead." Emily pressed herself against her husband. "Oh, don't be silly. You know what? After the funeral, we'll go over to your dad's house like you promised, Mom," Bobby suggested. He figured that the memories of his parents would have a bitter taste in his wife's mouth for a long time to come. So he just had to be patient. He couldn't get over death himself just yet. Still, life was taking its toll. The boys were running wild, and his wife was due to give birth to another son. Could he have hoped for such happiness? Jason was finally caught and put behind bars. Except he wasn't about to give up the stash. Bobby knew that Jason wasn't likely to live long in prison because he had deceived a very dangerous man, so one could understand why he kept the secret. It was the last guarantee that he would be allowed to live. "Do you remember when Mom said before she died that there would be a good catch under the bridge?" I suddenly thought, what if that's where Jason hid the diamonds? Emily said when they arrived at her late father's cabin. It could very well be. He said in the interrogation that he would have finished me off if he'd found it. It's entirely possible Jason had another thing to do here. Bobby began to feel the space under the bridge and almost cut himself on a thin, very inconspicuous fishing line. He pulled on it. Somehow Emily wasn't surprised at all when she saw that there was a polyethylene-wrapped weight tied to it. Transparent rocks. The last thing Jason had left. And for some reason, that was the day he'd been gone for mysterious reasons. He'd fallen, hit himself. Yeah, so unfortunate as to be fatal. That was the official story. Bobby and Emily turned the jewelry into the state as found treasure and got their rightful quarter. And just in time for the couple to have a son. They named him Ben after Emily's dad. Amazingly, the day he was born coincided with the day his father was born. It's okay to branch out. Let each kid have his own room, Bobby suggested. And just in case he bought a house with a room to spare that could fit at least 3 more kids. And you're an optimist, Emily laughed. But she herself wouldn't mind having more additions over time. Children made her truly happy. It seemed as if all those years before she hadn't lived at all, but just existed next to a man who needed her only as a servant, and a souvenir in one person. Of course, the secret was that there was a man who had loved her for a long time, and to whom she could now reciprocate fully. To Bobby had become her sun that had suddenly risen in the sky and made life meaningful. And that's what she'd said in his ear one day. And her husband replied that if he really was a luminary, he was created only to light up her and the children's lives. Emily knew that wasn't true. Bobby helped tons of people and saved lives every day at work. He was a light to so many, and his wealthy father had talked him out of his dangerous job for nothing. Emily knew her husband would always listen. That's just the way he is. He didn't want security, and he didn't want comfort. And she was sure Bobby would live happily ever after, because he was loved at home. The girl tried to cover her face with her hands. Around her classmates were running around her and pulling her hair. Ugly. Ben Swan shouted at the top of his lungs. Look at her. Elephant ears. Anne didn't even cry. She was used to being bullied by her classmates. She knew that if she stood still, they would quickly calm down and let her go. That's what happened that time. After about 5 minutes, the excitement disappeared. The girl quickly took her bag and ran towards the house. But when she ran 10 meters, a stone hit her in the back. Ah, she cried out and turned round. Behind her, Ben was laughing at the top of his lungs. The girl cried. Time passed, and the boy's hatred seemed to fade. But her classmates seemed to go mad. Anne had always had a reputation for being the ugliest girl in the class. And then the real miracles began to happen. She became not just a teenager, but a real beauty. Her gorgeous thick hair covered her big ears, her huge nose seemed to shrink, and Anne's unusually beautiful eyes came to the fore. The girls in her class, sensing great competition, tried their best to uphold a long-standing tradition. What a freak, they whispered behind her. How could the earth be so ugly? By graduation, life had put everything in its place. And the ugly duckling, her beauty, overshadowed all the written beauties of the school. But by the end of her studies, Anne had already formed such a low self-esteem that she could not develop confidence in herself because of her appearance. The girl's parents were ordinary laborers, and they simply had neither the physical strength nor such looks to help their daughter in any way. On the contrary, Anne in their eyes was a girl of modesty, and this was very much appreciated in the society in which they lived. The only thing that saved our heroine was studying. Since she had neither girlfriends nor friends, she devoted all her time to lessons, so that the only student for many years held in her hands a gold medal and dreamed of institute. However, Anne entered the university easily. There were no problems in passing the exams. The examiner even joked at her. I feel that a new luminary of science awaits us, perhaps. He shook the student's hand after the exams were over. And so the small town was left behind. How Anne wished then that her complexes were in the past. But no, she brought them all to the University of Florida, which greatly complicated the girl's life. It's been 17 years. Anne, please look at this document, asked the chief. The woman adjusted her large glasses and began to carefully read every word. What do you think? He exclaimed, folding his arms across his chest. I don't like their condition, she scratched her head. It's a lot to take on. I wouldn't risk it, Anne concluded. Neither would I. We don't know what they'll do with our equipment. Maybe they'll break something on purpose, sighed the director. And I don't like all these non-standard contracts. There are time-tested documents. Why reinvent the wheel? Exactly, because they want to hide something from us, Anne said sadly. "Mr. Jason, let's check them out, have another meeting, and then, as they say, either kick them up the arse or hug them." "Let's do it." He agreed and walked out of his deputy's office. He kept wiping his sweaty face from the exertion. Anne sighed. She had worked with Mr. Jason for years. She'd come to him from the institute, in fact, and over the years she'd worked hard to grow into a good position. She still had some grasp of other people's psychology, but she had a good grasp of her own. Miami was burning hot. It was the most unbearable heat. Neither fans nor air conditioning could help. Anne put a bottle of ice on her forehead. It always worked for her. Even her head felt like it was going to boil. She sighed, fixed her wedding ring on her finger. Something had to be done. Again, the painful question appeared in her mind. "I'm indulging him myself. And what's the result?" Anne wondered. "What's changed in the last few years?" "Nothing. How long can you lie on the sofa without working? I don't believe in his illness anymore. Why do others get better, but he doesn't?" Anne drove home in a low mood. Every day it seemed to her more and more that her marriage had been a mistake. As soon as the girl began her university studies, her life changed dramatically. Anne's parents did not have so much money to rent her a separate accommodation, so she, like many other students, was lucky she was given a place in the dormitory. But for Anne, it was a real stress. The reserved girl found herself in a room with two other, more open and cheerful students. Friendship between them did not develop, but they lived, in general, not bad. Almost the whole first year, Anne suffered from insomnia. She'd never lived so close to anyone before. And she had her own room at home, and here she was sharing her life with strangers. But her passion for her studies overcame the awkwardness, and Anne concentrated on her studies. In her 5th year, Anne was hired by an industrial equipment company. Before enrolling, Anne never had any doubts that she needed to graduate in engineering. The girl saw great prospects in this field, so from the very first day of her work experience, Anne began to work hard for a better future. And in 3 years, she had already become a leading employee. She was able to take out a flat on credit. It seemed that life had improved. The salary was good. Every now and then she was praised by the general manager. And in 2 years, a new miracle happened. For health reasons, the last director left and strongly recommended to appoint Anne as a director. So, in her almost 30s, Anne was already working as a general manager, and for the next couple of years, she was able to pay off her loan in full and buy herself a car. When she first came to work, the company was headed by Mr. Jason's father, but he soon died suddenly, and the young man took all the responsibility on himself. At first, all the employees were afraid that he would fail. But no. The young man proved to be quite resilient and competent to take his father's company to the next level. "I wish it would rain," Anne walked out of the office building. "I can't take it anymore." She was originally from the South herself, but the localized climate that Miami had made the city unbearable in the summer. Truth be told, despite the proximity of the ocean, they didn't get out to it that often on weekends. Usually Anne would pick up some paperwork and do something at home. I don't want anything, the woman exhaled. But she was well aware that she still had to stop at the shop. Michael hadn't been out of bed for the last month. At first, Anne was very worried about her husband, but then she began to notice the blush on his face. She had various thoughts in her head, but being busy at work and her mother-in-law, although not often, but interfered in their lives. Anne felt as if she were in charge of her husband. Michael was more like her appendage than a separate being. The lack of friends also made things much worse. Anne didn't really have anyone to talk to. Her parents weren't really interested in her affairs. She helped them buy a nice house, so they just lived their lives, and Anne seemed to have everything. She eventually sold her 1-bedroom flat, and just before she met Michael, decided to invest the money and bought a 2-bedroom flat. But here is a family happiness to her never came, although everything started so beautifully. In his 32, Anne finally met him. Or rather, Michael himself approached her. Anne had seen him a couple of times at work. He was the office supplies manager. Michael read the sign that said this office was the office of the chief engineer. Knocking, he was invited in by Mrs. Anne. A Hollywood smile flooded the guest's face. "I'm here to see you. Last time you ordered something, but we didn't have that model then. Can I offer you something in return?" Quickly, he took a huge catalog out of the bag and began to leaf through it. Anne was concentrating on her work, and couldn't understand what he wanted from her. "What do you think of this shelving unit?" Michael poked his finger and chose the more expensive options. "It will look great in your interior." The guest was so confused that the general manager poked at the first option and closed the catalog. "A very good choice," Michael said with a smile. By the way, he glanced at the woman's hands. "I hope you won't mind if I send you a present from me personally." No, Anne didn't take his words to heart. She stared at her papers again. The working day was almost over when there was another knock on Anne's door. She asked to come in. A courier stood in front of her, holding a gorgeous bouquet. She looked at him in bewilderment. "These are for you." The man handed her the flowers. "Please sign." There was a note in the bouquet to the most beautiful woman in the world, she read. "I can't make any sense of it. Maybe someone mixed it up." But the piece of paper definitely had an address and her last name on it. She set the flowers down and concentrated on her work again. Several times she lifted her glasses and wondered who it could be. Anne didn't take the roses home. She safely forgot about them as soon as she grabbed her coat. 3 days later, Michael reappeared in the office. He brought the ordered furniture. He went to see the general manager again. "I hope you like the flowers," he said shyly. "I really wanted to make you happy." "Oh, it was you?" Surprised woman. "Thank you, yes. The flowers were excellent." And yet the next day Anne remembered the flowers and took the roses home. "I realize this may seem indecent of me," the man blushed. "But I'd really like to invite you to dinner," Michael said. Anne blushed too. "I don't even know," she replied simply. "I have so much work to do." "But you can do it once." He pressed her a little. "Please, just one evening." And Anne agreed. Of course, she often traveled to business meetings, restaurants, and clients, but she still had no personal life. In principle, the woman had made her peace with that, and Michael was charming. Every now and then he praised Anne and everything she did. The compliments poured in, making the woman feel uncomfortable. Something in her heart twitched. A strong desire to have a family and indeed to love and be loved by someone rose to the surface. Her beloved man looked after her in such a way that it seemed that there was no better man in the whole world. Romance, live concerts, long walks. Anne had given up. For the first time in her life, she let go of her inner tension and fell in love. It's safe to say she was happy then. "Marry me," Michael asked her one day. "Anne, I love you. You're my woman." After this proposal was immediately met with the man's mother. She turned out to be a real angel. Mrs. Caroline kept echoing her son's sentiments. How extraordinary Anne is. The lack of experience of close contact with people did its job, and Anne completely trusted her fiancé and his mother. The wedding was not too pompous, although there were plenty of guests present. And somehow it happened from the beginning that Michael moved into his wife's flat. They wouldn't have been able to live at his mother's place in a one-bedroom anyway. And it all seemed so logical. That's how the family life of our heroine began. It should be emphasized once again that the lack of serious relationships Anne with the opposite sex drew in her imagination great love, for which she was ready to go to the edge of the world. Not immediately, but the woman began to notice that her husband is somehow not quite like the one she imagined. A year after the wedding, Michael quit his job. Then he spent almost a year interviewing for a job, but he never found a decent position. "Michael, well, you have a good experience of working with people," his wife Anne advised him. "Just start small. I'm sure in a couple of months you'll be noticed and promoted." "I'm sick and tired of being on the dole," he said angrily. "I can't understand what they want from me. But how can they offer me 30 to 40,000 with my skills? You're being paid 150. "Michael," Anne said, "but I'm deputy director now. I have so much responsibility that I'm in charge of all the processes in our company." "And you think I had no responsibility in my office?" "My husband wouldn't give up. No, I've had enough. Either let them pay me at least 60 to 70, or..." He stopped talking. "But not every company will pay a deputy like me 155. I know small offices where the deputy director gets 50. It depends on the size of the company." As much as Anne wanted to help Michael, she couldn't. She had no idea that her husband's arrogance had not come from nothing. "Son, you're so lucky to have her." My darling Mrs. Caroline nodded. "Where else would she find such a man? You don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't look at other women. You've got to fulfill yourself, haven't you? While you're looking for a decent job, let Anne support you. It's normal," she stressed the last word, "if she's so lucky in life. Though who knows how she got to be the deputy," she said quietly so that her son wouldn't hear her. Mrs. Caroline did not stoop to primitive insults, but she always spoke plainly. So from the outside, she looked like a woman of wisdom who should have listened. Michael, you could say, was a fan of his mother. If he had been asked to name a woman who embodied the feminine ideal, he would have called her name without hesitation. "I feel bad for Anne sometimes," Michael admitted honestly. "After all, she does work weekends." "Michael, times have changed," Mrs. Caroline replied. "Who says a man has to support a woman?" She raised an eyebrow. "And there's no telling what kind of job you'll get. Let's say you're offered a deputy or even a director's position. You have experience, and you know how to communicate with people. And then what do you get? If you get a higher salary, Anne has to feel uncomfortable. That's not the way it works." His mother's arguments seemed reasonable to him. In fact, she was the one who had steered his son in the right direction, so to speak. When Michael told her that he liked a woman who was doing well in life, Mrs. Caroline, in her manner, as if by accident, advised him to look at this Anne. Mrs. Caroline was well aware of her son's worthlessness. She was determined to do everything she could to marry him to Anne. She had a 3-room flat and a huge salary by her standards. Who would want her inactive son? No matter how hard Michael's mother tried, he grew up as an uninitiative guy. He struggled to graduate from college. Twice Mrs. Caroline almost married him off, of course, to girls with a better position. But nobody wanted to look at Michael. So it was his mother, not he, who was behind all the courtship of Anne. She outlined the program point by point, how he should behave, what to talk about, how to dress. From Michael's descriptions, his mother quickly realized that Anne was a common gray mouse, so she had no doubt that she could easily handle her. Somehow, Mrs. Caroline insisted that Michael keep his job for another year. They were going to sack him for irresponsibility, but the woman talked to the director and cried that they needed money for medication. In general, with a bit of grief, Michael was left for another year. At the beginning of the 3rd year of married life, in order not to inflame the situation, he finally accepted the offer of one enterprise. And Anne was happy in a way, too. "My son is a businessman," Mrs. Caroline said proudly. "He opened a huge bakery, and for the first 6 months everything seemed to be going well. But then, in a flash." "What happened?" Anne ran up to Michael. "When he came home late one night, they made me sign the papers," he said through tears. In her husband's version, the competitors hired thugs and took the bakery away from him. In reality, of course, it was the other way round. Michael, as they say, failed in his elementary duties. In his life, he never had assistants who would knead dough and bake pies for free. Because of his laziness and slackness, he blew it all. 2 weeks after this terrible event, Michael became seriously ill. Again, on his mother's advice. Anne's mind was reeling. Not only had she lost the money she had worked so hard to earn, but now her husband was ill with some rare, incurable disease. "Anne, don't worry," Michael groaned. "Mum will take care of me." Secretly from Anne, Michael wrote a power of attorney for his car, which, incidentally, also bought him a wife. And it wasn't cheap, so now there was an excuse to make it look like Mrs. Caroline had to take care of her son. As far as Anne knew, she was working, but according to her mother-in-law, they let her go when she needed to. Anne was under stress. Her hands shook as she read the doctor's report. "What does it mean?" she asked her mother-in-law. "Is it treatable? Should we go to New York or Los Angeles?" There's no point," Mrs. Caroline sighed. "Anne, he needs a rest. He's exhausted himself because of this business of his." She wept. "My boy has worked so hard for you." Anne felt a hidden reproach. The wife certainly felt some resentment towards Michael, just throwing away $1 million, but now she was ashamed of it. "Don't worry, I'll take care of his treatment myself," said the mother-in-law. "Only the doctor prescribed expensive medication," mother-in-law said carefully. "I'll transfer the money to Michael's card." You can spend as much as you need." "Thank you, darling." Mrs. Caroline hugged her and sobbed. "I have a golden daughter-in-law. How lucky my son is. I'm so grateful to you for not abandoning Michael in his hour of need." To be honest, Mrs. Caroline had been frightened out of her wits when her worthless Michael had lost his pie shop. The woman realized that if some tragic event wasn't introduced now, she might drop him. And to lose such a feeding ground would be a complete folly for both of them. So Michael developed a rare autoimmune disease, naturally incurable. "Mum, I can't stay in bed all the time." Michael sighed. "Are you having a crisis?" she said. "When you go into remission, you'll feel better. So there will be times when you'll be lying down, but most of the time you'll be able to drive your car, go for walks. Are you sick? Be thankful you have such a wonderful wife." Anne did go to the doctor who supposedly treated her husband. He confirmed the diagnosis on the certificate. It didn't even occur to the woman that he'd just been paid off. If she had made Michael retake the tests with another doctor, then everything would have been clarified. But she was used to trusting her husband, and she would never have thought of such perfidy. Anne was secretive, but she was generally good with people. Anne got out of the car and headed for her driveway. She stopped at the shop and bought 2 bags of groceries. It was mostly ready-to-eat or convenience foods. Because of her stressful job, Anne was woefully short of time to do household chores. Mr. Jason had made her not just a deputy, but an assistant, a consultant, and a friend in one person. This, of course, put additional responsibilities on the woman, but basically the chief was the only person she could be friends with. There were never any games or lies between them. They both told each other the truth. She was very comfortable in Mr. Jason's company. In short, she would not hesitate to go on a scouting mission with him if it was offered to her. She opened the door to the flat and immediately heard a groan. She so wished she could have stayed in silence, but her husband's illness was adding to her already frayed nerves. "Hi," she smiled, staring intently into Michael's face. For almost a week she couldn't control herself. Whenever she saw her husband, for some reason she paid attention to the color of his skin. To her surprise, his skin was pink and looked like a normal, healthy person. "How are you feeling?" she asked the traditional question. "Are you hungry?" "No, my mum left a while ago. She fed me," her husband said faintly. "She went to the doctor. He said that in a week or so I should feel better and I should be able to go out." "All right," she smiled wryly. "Then I'll go to work. I have to." "I guess it's my fault," Anne thought, chewing on a cutlet. "I wanted a family so badly, but I didn't realize it wasn't just for one night. I have a job. I can't devote as much time to Michael as he wants. Otherwise, who would work?" Lately, Anne had even started watching programs. She wanted to know how other spouses lived, what they did. "I feel like there's something wrong with me," Anne sighed. "Maybe family is just not my thing. There are women who stay alone for the rest of their lives." Anne had never thought about children. Or rather, she was insanely afraid of this question. "Maybe I should see a psychologist?" A thought flashed through her head. "I won't be able to do that for so long." She covered her face with her hands, tears welling up involuntarily. She rarely felt sorry for herself. She was used to suppressing negative feelings or forbidding herself from feeling them. The next day, during her lunch break, the woman made an appointment with a specialist. End of the working day. Anne was looking forward to it on the one hand, but on the other she was apprehensive. She took a deep breath, knocked on the door, and was invited in. In front of her was a man in his 50s. He smiled radiantly. Anne was touched by the fact that his smile was genuine. She could feel it. "I wish I could swim in the sea right now. I can feel with my skin how cool the water is," said the psychologist cheerfully. "I am so attracted to the open space. I like the forest more." Anne joined the conversation. "There you can hide from prying eyes." "Do you think someone is following you?" The man asked a provocative question. "Sometimes I do," she admitted honestly. "I feel that I always have to be on guard. It's the only way I can be safe." "And how would you describe this danger?" he asked cautiously. "You could use adjectives like slippery, cold, terrifying." The guest hesitated. She had never gone so deep inside herself, and immediately she felt fear. I would say danger is someplace where I feel bad, where I feel intense fear. Is that where something is going to happen to you? The psychologist asked a leading question. Can you visualize this event? I just feel that something could happen, and I would suffer a lot, she sighed. Are you happy now? The man asked the unexpected question. Just the very fact that I have you says that you are not. You are already suffering. Anne's lips quivered and tears flowed from her eyes. The psychologist waited silently for her to release her emotions. I feel a constant inner tension. It's wearing me out, she whispered. My husband is seriously ill and I don't know what to do about it. Are you worried that your husband will die? The man asked. Do you feel that you are responsible for his life? No, the patient shook her head negatively. What's the right way to put it? Anne wondered. I'm afraid of being bad. Sometimes I think I can't stand it and imagine leaving my husband. I feel so ashamed. Why do you think that if you don't have the strength to look after him, you must be bad? And anyway, who determines whether a person is bad or good? But it is understandable, the people around us, said the woman. And she was struck by the answer. God, it turns out that I am with my husband not because I love him, but because I want to be good in other people's eyes. In whose eyes exactly? The psychologist kept his eyes on her. Can you name specific people? Yes, my parents, my husband's mother, he himself, she looked at the man pleadingly. Especially the last two. Would you say that your husband and his mother define what you should be? The psychologist concluded. Do you understand? Anne clenched her fingers nervously. As a child, I was constantly laughed at by my classmates, and I didn't think I could ever get married. I never had any friends. Tears came out of her eyes again. So you're saying that because your husband paid attention to you, you're willing to serve him. You were bad in your own eyes. How else do you explain being laughed at? He hurt her feelings. And when someone paid attention to you, were you willing to be anything to avoid feeling humiliated and guilty again? Anne took a break. Went outside. Her hands were shaking. She couldn't seem to hide anything from the psychologist. He could see right through her. 10 minutes later, Anne came back. I've decided that I'd rather be hurt now, but I'd rather be free of this burden once and for all, she said. Anne, why were you bullied by your classmates? The doctor suddenly plunged a knife into her heart. I was ugly as a child, she sobbed. That's why everyone laughed at me. Which girl in your class was the prettiest, please? The man kept his eyes on her. I don't know, she answered timidly. I never thought about it. I thought many of my classmates looked like me. Catherine had ears as big as mine. Elizabeth was very thin. If I told you now that you were no different from any other girl, how would you feel now? Mr. Jason asked. As if there had never been all that mockery of me, Anne answered suddenly. It was just a dream. Exactly. You were never an ugly girl. Can you understand that? Ugliness is so rare. What is it when a child has 11 fingers instead of 10, or one body and two heads like Siamese twins? Everything else is normal. Think of your worst abuser. And now from your current level, tell me, was he or she beautiful? No, Anne immediately thought of Ben Swan, the bully in her class. He even had a nasty look on his face. After the first session, Anne had a real revolution. It was funny to her how she could react to her classmates like that, because it was her reaction that determined everything. If she, as a child, had not believed that she was ugly, they would have all quickly moved away from her. With Michael, the situation was similar. It was just that now she was on the opposite side. After all, he had convinced her that she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Naturally, it was more pleasant to be on this side than as a child, with constant humiliation. Neither of these things will make me happy, Anne whispered as she stopped the car outside the house. I just agreed to marry Michael because he covered my complexes, and I was willing to pay for it. God. I was willing to pay for being treated well and loved. The woman was so scared of feeling powerless again, like when she was a child. So she saw Michael as a guarantee that it would never happen to her again. And if there's a demand, there's always a supply. Nothing new. Anne's request had been heard, and Michael was exactly what she needed. The truth caused a lot of pain, but the woman decided she'd had enough. She was tired of playing the role of the perfect wife. Besides, she felt that everything in her life was one-sided. Anyone would have noticed that from the outside. She walked resolutely into the flat. She decided to distance herself from her husband's illness and be more cold-blooded about the whole situation. "Anne, you've come already," said Miss Caroline. "Mom said I need to pay the insurance for my car." The wife was silent. Michael looked at her in bewilderment. "Anne?" He looked into her face and said. Anne was glowing. "Since Mrs. Caroline is driving it now, I think she can pay for it," she said calmly. Her husband almost jumped out of bed. Anne noticed the impulse. There was a look of bewilderment in his eyes. "I'm already spending almost all the money on your treatment," Anne exclaimed. "Let your mother do something to help," she said calmly. The man was not prepared for such a development. He didn't even know what to say to her. "I will continue my work with the psychologist," Anne said to herself. "Stop writing me. I've never been in anyone's debt. There's nothing wrong with me." And Michael lay there in pain. He'd promised his mother he'd wire her the insurance money tonight. The money Anne had sent for his medication, his mother had already withdrawn and hidden. "Michael, what's up?" She called him tomorrow morning. "I need to drop off the paperwork." "Mom, she won't give me the insurance money," her son whispered quietly to her. What Mrs. Caroline snapped out of her role. Is she out of her mind? The mother-in-law was outraged. "Oh, I didn't like my daughter-in-law's answer. All these years I've been courting her, and now this." "Well, I'll arrange for you." She was angry. "If you don't want to be nice, I'll take more money from you." Naturally, Mrs. Caroline could do nothing. She just polluted the air with her profanity. But somehow the woman was sure that she would find a way out of Anne. At the second session, Anne realized even more that something was wrong in her relationship with her husband. "Why don't you have children?" The psychologist asked the question head-on. "It's fear," he glared at the patient. "Yes," she said confidently. "I'm afraid that I won't be able to cope with motherhood and that I'll be judged." "Anne, you have to look at your motivation, that is, what has driven you so far," the doctor said seriously. "It hurts me to be humiliated," she replied immediately. "So you've been driven by fear?" "Yes. But that's not all." Anne reflected. She looked at her life, but could only find a constant struggle for her psychological comfort. "The second is much harder to see." The psychologist understood her confusion. "Your second motivation was to do anything to avoid being yourself." He drew a stunning conclusion. "After all, from your childhood experience, it turned out that if you are as you are, then you will surely be punished for it. And since you couldn't change the shape of your ears or shorten your nose, it seemed that you were doomed to humiliation. Being yourself was bad, it was dangerous." Something came up to Anne's throat and she cried. The psychologist had made it clear to her that this was so. The woman had always been afraid of herself. It seemed to her that the true Anne was somehow unseemly. She didn't live up to the standards set. And if she became herself again, she would suffer so much that she might die of pain. That's a lie. The psychologist brought her back to reality. Only when you are yourself will you find true happiness. It is all these imposed roles that create suffering in your life. You must have the courage to look at the Anne you have inside you. There is no other way. Perhaps Anne could have said it was the most important day of her life. But there was a real revolution in her mind from the mere idea that she wasn't real now. Her fear receded. So Anne decided, no matter what, to only move forward. On the way home, a strange thought popped into her head. She turned the car around and drove towards a medical center. Anne had been there a couple of times before. "Would you go tomorrow at 11 o'clock? The nurse asked her. "We will come with the doctor because we have to take blood for a test." Why Anne had decided not to warn Michael, she didn't know. It was just her intuition that told her to do it that way. "I don't want him to get nervous early," the woman made up a reason for herself. She was a little embarrassed that her husband wasn't talking to her. Perhaps earlier she would have liked to know why, but then she somehow just took it all in stride. The next morning, she went into the chief's office to excuse herself for an hour. Mr. Jason was sitting there with a sad face. "Did something happen to you?" she asked fearfully. "Are you pale? Do you have blood pressure?" "No," he sighed. "It's just a family emergency, but it'll pass." He tried to smile. Mr. Jason was going to celebrate his 45th birthday this year, but things hadn't worked out. The children had grown up and moved into their own flat, bought by their father. And with his wife, they lived like strangers. "I'm tired," Mr. Jason admitted. "You know, sometimes I think about selling the business. I can't take it anymore." "I understand." The woman sat down on the table. "You and I are like two squirrels in a wheel. We're going to get kicked out of it someday. The only question is whether we'll be alive afterwards." "I don't know," he said seriously. "Anne, why do I need all this? I've got everything I need. I want a peaceful old age." "You are still young," smiled the assistant. "The midlife crisis ages us all. You and I live in such a beautiful place, but we don't have time to go to the ocean," he sighed. "Mr. Jason, I need an hour with my husband." "The doctor has to be here?" Anne asked. The man waved his hand. He trusted his deputy like he trusted himself. He'd never had a problem with Anne. "Is there any point in trying to keep the family together if I discussed her?" Mr. Jason reasoned. "Lucy had already fulfilled her every whim, and now she was no longer interested in me." His wife's coldness had become annoying of late. People always think that lack of money is the only problem for scandals in a family. But Mr. Jason could say with complete certainty that it didn't make any difference. You can be loved for money. But when you get so much of it that a person stops hiding their sincere intentions from you, that's the end of it. Lucy, Mr. Jason's wife, was no longer afraid of losing him. It seemed to him that she was even deliberately doing everything she could to make him the first to offer her a divorce. That way the woman could get a great deal of money. And considering the fact that Lucy had never worked, it still wasn't fair in her husband's eyes. Of course he wasn't going to leave her penniless, but to give away half of the business, just like that, was a real sacrilege. "All right," he sighed. As long as it lasted. We'll see about that." Anne glanced nervously at her watch. She was due home at 10:45. Mrs. Caroline, according to Michael, usually visited him at an hour or two when she brought him a fresh lunch. She opened the flat door, entered quietly, peered into her husband's room and froze. The bed was empty. Anne went through all the rooms, but Michael wasn't home. So Anne decided to call him. "Michael, hello," she took an air and tried to say each word calmly. "How are you? What are you doing?" "Hi," he said quietly. "Anne, what can I do? I've been lying around all day. I can't even get to the loo. Mom should be here soon." There was a click, and the door opened. My husband Michael appeared in the corridor. He almost fell through the floor when he saw Anne. "I went to the drugstore. I didn't want to upset you," he mumbled in his defense. "I could barely make it back." "Get down." The wife ordered him to lie down. "The doctor is coming to examine you." "Why?" Michael asked Anne a strange question. "The doctor just came the other day." "Well, as they say, trust but verify," she said angrily. "Come on, they'll be here in a minute." "I'm not going to see another doctor." Michael got angry and sat down on the couch. "If you don't trust me, say so." He began to use a clever trick. "That's it." Anne screamed. Her husband has never seen her so angry. "Do you think you found a fool? That's it, I've had enough. Or you stop this comedy." She rushed into the corridor and ran out of the flat. "Oh shit," Michael cursed at himself. "Why did I go to the shop, you idiot? What's going to happen now?" He dialed his mother's number. Anne drove to work and sobbed. She hated everyone, especially herself. She had to be so stupid. "Divorce him," she said to herself. "Let the dependent get out of my flat. A bloody Alfonso. That's it, I've had enough." She closed herself in her office and there was a knock. She didn't open the door right away. The chief came in. "Anne, what are you doing?" He was frightened. "Anne, He ran for cold water. "Mr. Jason, how can you be such an idiot?" She stammered. "He played a trick on me. He was never sick, do you understand? He just didn't want to work, and he thought I'd just keep feeding him." So the man scratched his head. "This is all very familiar to me. Get your things," he ordered, and grabbed her arm. Mr. Jason deftly fitted himself into the rows of cars. 40 minutes later, they pulled onto the open motorway. On the way, the chief stopped to buy cold water and something to eat. The two of them sat on a deserted beach. Mr. Jason knew a couple of good places like that, silent and staring off into the distance. You could tell that both the man and the woman were experiencing the same thing. "I told her first," the chief turned to Anne. "I can't take it anymore. I come home and she turns her nose up at me. I'm sick of it. At first I was ashamed in front of the kids, but they're grown up and have their own lives. I'm going to file for divorce too." "Mr. Jason, how could you use me like that?" the assistant whispered. "I'm not made of iron. Somehow he's convinced he's the only one who needs me. What's wrong with me?" She looked at the man. "Anne, yes, all this is nonsense," he smiled. "This I say to you as a representative of the stronger sex. As for me, you should be chased by a crowd of men. Do you want me to prove it to you tonight? You'll be fighting off your admirers. You owe me a nice dress and loose hair." "Where are we going?" she asked Jason hesitantly. "I don't know, Anne, but you've known me for days," he stroked her head. "How could I get you into anything bad?" "No," she shook her head negatively. "All right then, I accept your challenge." She rose to her feet. "Stop being a whiner. If I want to be happy, I have to do it myself." It was about 7 o'clock. When they got back to the office, she got into her car. They'd arranged for Mr. Jason to pick her up at 9. She didn't even pay any attention to her husband. Quickly, she went into her room, locked herself in, pulled out her prettiest dress, put on her eyelashes, unraveled her ponytail. She heard her mother-in-law's voice behind her back. "We need to talk," she said in a commanding voice. Anne said nothing to her and left the flat. Mrs. Caroline stared at her in bewilderment. "Where is she going?" the mother asked her son Michael, who came up to her. "I don't understand." Meanwhile, Anne jumped into the car with the chief. He smiled. "Let's go, shall we?" He laughed. "I hope you're not going to leave me, Mr. Jason. What if someone comes on to me?" The woman was afraid. "You're not alone. Your beau will be sitting nearby." He pointed his finger at himself. Anne laughed merrily. She had seldom experienced such a state of lightness and joy. "Well then, let's get on with the adventure." The passenger commanded, and the car started. They stopped outside a decent club. Mr. Jason knew that it was a respectable men's club, so it wasn't the sort of place where fighting or brawling was part of the program. "Come out," he said, giving his lady a hand. "You had a husband, and now you are completely free. So put a smile on your face." It was Anne's first time in a place like this. She raised her head high and seemed to swim to the table. Mr. Jason deliberately sat down at another. No sooner had Anne looked at the menu than a waiter approached her. He was holding a bottle of wine. "This is for you from that gentleman over there." The guy gently showed his hand, along with wishes for a good evening. Anne, like a lady of the world, inclined her head in agreement, turned round and looked at the chief. He was smiling at her with his arms crossed over his chest. Mr. Jason was absolutely right. About 10 people had met her today. "You are simply irresistible," an older man said to her. "Shall we play roulette? A lady like that must love gambling." "Unfortunately, I am an exception to the rule," she smiled. "Besides, my man should be here soon." All in an hour, Anne was even tired. She was not used to such attention from men. The chief noticed her uneasiness and sat down beside her. "I counted 11, he said cheerfully. "Well, shall we dance now?" He held out his hand to her. Anne was afraid to tell him that she had never danced in her life. But Mr. Jason quickly put his arm round her waist and led the way. "Mr. Jason, you've opened up a whole new world for me." She couldn't catch her breath when they returned to the table. "But this place is more for flings," he admitted. "But that doesn't change anything." "Oh, you." Anne wanted to tell him, but she laughed out loud. "That's why they come to me so easily." "But I couldn't tell you that," said the chief seriously. "Otherwise you would never have agreed." The night brought a little chill, and the colleagues walked along the deserted street. "I love it when the crickets sing," Mr. Jason said. "You know, it's been a long time since I've had a rest. Thank you, Lord. It's like I've lost 10 years, he said. "You know, I don't want to lie. I don't want to go home," she said. "My husband is the past of my life." "I feel the same way now. Anne, we have to move on," he stopped in front of her. "Our fixation on all these standards. Oh my God. It's like I've just woken up from a long sleep," Anne whispered. "What have I done to myself? I've hated myself all this time." It was about 3 o'clock when Mr. Jason stopped the car outside her house. They were silent for a while. Neither of them wanted to break the magic silence. "See you tonight," he said quietly. "Until today," she repeated. The principal watched her swim towards the driveway. Anne's luxurious hair fluttered in the wind. "A stunning woman," he sighed. "Why hadn't we met before?" Michael sat in the corridor, leaning against the wall, asleep. He never waited for his wife to return. She hadn't returned his calls. Anne shamelessly stepped over him and locked herself in her room. She didn't care. The divorce issue had been settled. Now it was only a matter of time for Anne. She had no interest in Michael and what would happen to him now. She got up early on purpose. It wasn't even 7 o'clock. Anne dressed quickly. She didn't want to see her husband. He was still lying in the corridor. He opened his eyes abruptly, rushed to his wife's room, but it was closed. Did she not sleep at home tonight? He thought in horror. God, what's happening to her? He rang his mother, who promised to come soon. Mrs. Caroline was very nervous about her daughter-in-law. She really didn't like the whole story. "God forbid she should find someone else," she said, pacing up and down the room. "Michael, how could you do this to me? I told you to lie down. You should be up and about by next week." "She won't even talk to me," the son said through his tears. "So is Mum going to be with me now? If she..." "There will be no divorce?" She threw angrily at him. "Nobody needs your Anne but you." Maybe she just couldn't take it, found herself a man for the evening. No one's going to have a serious relationship with her. "Have you seen the glasses she wears? She's a skank, for God's sake. How can you even sleep in the same bed with her?" Mrs. Caroline was deliberately exaggerating Anne's shortcomings. She didn't know that last night her daughter-in-law had shown her beauty to the full. And if only she'd given a reason, someone would have hit on her. "Mum, talk to her," Michael begged. "I can't do this without her. I love her." "Tell her you love her money," she said angrily. "All right, I'll stay with you tonight. Otherwise I won't catch her." Anne was almost asleep by her computer when the chief came in and put a mug of strong coffee in front of her. "How are you?" he asked her thoughtfully. "Anne, I was up almost all night, as if in some kind of euphoria. But I can't open my eyes now," Mr. Jason smiled. "I'm starving," she whispered, resting her head on the table. "Come on, get up," said the headmaster. "Let's go to lunch. I'm starving myself." They dragged themselves to the car. She thought she fell asleep on the way. Mr. Jason ordered some interesting juice, and they felt energized immediately afterwards. "That's it." The man wiped his flushed face. "Can you feel the blood rushing through your body?" he asked Anne. "What is it made of?" she asked. "There are some berries in it, but the main ingredient is natural pomegranate juice. The additives are up to you," said Mr. Jason. He looked at Anne with undisguised curiosity. And the day came to an end. Mr. Jason was returning home with a strange feeling. He had already gone up to the first floor when he clearly felt that the time had come. "Lucy," he knocked on the door of his wife's room. "Can we talk to you?" "About what?" she said nonchalantly, not leaving the room. That gave Mr. Jason even more confidence in his next move. "About us," he said coldly. "Come out, please. This is serious." Lucy deliberately delayed her exit. Finally, the door opened, and she cast a disgruntled glance at her husband. "Lucy, let's not lie to ourselves," he said simply. "We don't love each other and haven't for a long time." "So what do you suggest?" Carelessly threw the wife. "Don't spoil my mood for the night." "Divorce," he replied seriously. "Lucy, I don't see the point of our relationship anymore." The woman shuddered at first, then quickly pulled herself together and paused. "All right," Lucy finally replied, "if that's what you decide." She wanted to make him feel guilty. "Yes, I have made up my mind," Mr. Jason said firmly. "And if you don't mind, then you've made up your mind too." The wife didn't want to show her weakness. She would have liked the abandoned woman option, so she could vilify her husband later. Mr. Jason understood that. In recent years, he had unraveled Lucy's true nature to the point where nothing could surprise him. "I'll talk to the children myself," he suggested. He hesitated about the property. "I agree that you should take your half." Lucy was very happy with that. But Mr. Jason was no fool. He'd been in business too long. His wife was already planning how she would take over his business, but she was in for some unpleasant news. But the time had come. He dialed someone's number. "Hi, Brad. Have you changed your mind about buying my company yet?" he said. Anne was in no mood to go home. She was desperate for sleep. She entered the flat. "Good evening," her mother-in-law said with a certain intonation. "Anne, could we talk to you for a moment?" Anne nodded. She wanted to put an end to the whole story. Everyone sat down at the kitchen table. "Well, I guess I'll start," said Mrs. Caroline. "Anne," her tone softened, "we were afraid to tell you, so as not to spook your luck. Anyway, a week ago Michael's doctor informed me that he was much better. He also sternly instructed me that Michael should not take any risks for the time being. With his illness, deterioration can occur very quickly. But Michael was so tired of his illness that he told no one that day and went outside." "I see," Anne replied calmly. "Mrs. Caroline, I beg you, please help Michael to pack his things." Mother and son looked at each other. They couldn't understand what was going on in this situation. "It would be better for him to stay with you," calmly answered her daughter-in-law to her bewilderment. "Michael will recover much faster with you." But she didn't know what to say. "Anne, this is his home. Besides, I work too," said Mrs. Caroline. "That's all right. As they say, home will help," Miss Anne smiled. "And as for this being Michael's house, I'm sorry to disappoint you. This is my flat, and your son will no longer be living there." "Anne, what are you doing?" My husband turned pale. "We're family. I love you." "Well, I doubt that very much." Anne got up from the table. "All right, guests. I'll give you half an hour, take everything you need, and the rest you can pick up later. I'm sorry, I'm very tired today." Michael wanted to make a scene, but his mother signaled him with her hand. She realized that if he overplayed his hand now, they'd never get her back. And it was foolish to lose such a tidbit. Anne had already drifted off to sleep when she heard it. "We're going." She didn't say anything, only heard the lock click and rolled over onto her other side. "Mom, she's crazy." Michael couldn't calm down. "That idiot kicked us out." "Yeah, I'm not even going to look at her after that." "Michael, calm down," said his mother. "If she won't change her mind, then you'll have to make sure you get half the property. Don't be silly. No arguments. Do you understand me?" "I understand." He sat down tiredly on the bed in his old room. "Why did I have to go to that damn shop?" he lamented. Everything would be back to normal now. But Michael didn't realize that if it hadn't been for this incident, another one would have happened. Anne was just ripe for another life. They would have broken up anyway. And if he looked honestly, Michael initially had nothing to gain by the breakup of his and Anne's relationship. The next morning, Anne wasn't embarrassed by her husband's absence. She even felt like she should be. Happy, she went to work, dropped her bag, knocked on the door to the boss. "Mr. Jason, thank you. You have helped me change my life," she said happily. "That's it. I'm divorcing Michael. I don't want to do this anymore." "And I've got news for you too," the boss told her with a serious face. "I sold the company, so you will have a new boss." Anne immediately covered her face with her hands and cried, "How can I be without you?" Jason tried to comfort her, but she continued to cry. No amount of coaxing worked. "Let's go out tonight," Jason suggested. "We could sit somewhere together, okay?" He stared into her eyes. "Yes," she said, and sobbed again. "It'll be okay. I promise." He put his arms around her and pulled her close. "We'll have a serious talk tonight." The work wasn't going well. Anne looked at her watch every now and then. She had lost all interest in what she was doing. The director was not only her boss but also her friend, and it was not easy for her to be so close to another person. She was almost pulling up to the house when Michael called. Anne deliberately didn't pick up the phone. "Yes, idiots," she cursed. "I don't need you. What, you lost your feeder? Now you're just going to have to bite your elbows." Anne had no doubt that Michael was acting under the careful guidance of his mother, Mrs. Caroline. If he wanted his things, he'd find them himself, she decided, so she didn't stay home too long. Anne stood outside the restaurant to which Mr. Jason had invited her. With over an hour to go before the meeting, she just closed her eyes and dreamed. "I want a baby," Anne whispered. "God, why did I ever want Michael? I never loved him. He was like a leech on me, although now I realize why." The phone rang. It was the chief. He wanted to tell her he'd be here early. "I'm already here," Anne laughed. "I'm sitting in the car waiting for you." "Where are you?" She stepped out of the driver's door. Jason was standing by the door. He was holding a gorgeous bouquet. Anne blushed. "These are for you." He handed her the flowers. "Are you ready to have a good time tonight?" "You bet," she smiled. "Jason, I'll go to the end of the world with you." The man took her by the waist, and they walked in. He had a lot to tell his deputy today. "Anne, I'm divorcing my wife," he began. "To be fair, I sold my company to a good man, but not for the amount of money that's in the contract. Don't worry, there's nothing criminal about it. It's just that my wife is a bit of an arsehole. I'm sorry, but I don't want to go along with her. So I gave her half, or rather a third, of what I got for the firm. I'm not giving her the house either. Of course, she doesn't want to leave it, so she'll have to pay me my half. Don't worry. What she made in the divorce will last her till she's old enough, unless she spends $1 million a month." "What are you going to do now?" Miss Anne asked with interest. "You're a real professional." "But professionals retire, too," he laughed. "Anne, I want a normal life. I need someone who understands me, a reliable friend." The man kept his eyes on her. Anne realized that he was referring to her. Inside her, it was like butterflies were flying. Anne lowered her eyes, her breathing could be heard. She drank some juice as her throat was dry. "Anne, I don't want to play. I like you." Took her hand in his. "In fact, I think we're made for each other." How Anne at that moment wished she could go back to her childhood and show her classmates who she had become. What kind of man had chosen her? "You bastards, this is for you," flashed through her mind. "I'm a decent woman, so I want a decent man." "I give you time to think," came Mr. Jason's voice to her. "And I can answer at once," seriously, she said. "I do. I want a normal family. I want to have children." "We'll have children. I promise you," he pressed her hand in his. Anne had never had an evening like this in her life. She stood by her car, afraid to let Jason go. He didn't want to leave her either. The goodbye kiss came to an end. They hugged once more, and she got into the car. "I'll see you tomorrow," he waved. "Good night to you." The woman looked at him intently, but Anne's night was not going to be a very restful one. So far, she knew nothing about it. Driving home, it seemed to her that her car did not touch the ground. "Here it is, my long-awaited happiness," she said aloud. "We had worked side by side for so many years, and only now we realized that it was fate." She saw the light from the corridor and realized that Michael was home. Michael's doctor arrived today. He's taken a turn for the worse. Because of your scandal, he could die? Please help my son, Mrs. Caroline exclaimed. I can't. Anne shrugged her shoulders. I'm getting married. What her mother-in-law was surprised. What do you mean you're getting married? What about Michael? He'll die without you. But I'm not to blame for his illness, she glanced at her husband. If you've come to get your things, I'll wait. You can't do that, Michael's mother said sternly. Or did you have a lover? Her eyes narrowed and she looked like a fox. Was that the reason? No, Anne didn't want to continue the conversation. I just met my man the other day, so there was no question of cheating. Her mother-in-law's little eyes darted back and forth. She couldn't figure out what she needed to do to get things back to normal. Anne, her voice softened. But you realize Michael loves you. To know a man for a couple of days and leave a husband like that? She shook her head. I can assure you it's such a relief, Anne grinned. Take it easy. Michael couldn't take it anymore. I've worked so hard to make sure you have everything. She laughed. Are you saying I've been living off you all this time? You have no conscience at all? How much effort I put into my cafe, and all for you. You mean the pie shop that I gave you over $1 million for? Anne had no more patience for these insolents. That's it. I've had enough. Get out. Get out of my flat. She pointed at the door. I just hate you, you sneaky bastards who've been sitting on my neck all this time. Get out. You're going to regret this. Are you going to come crawling back to Michael on your knees? My mother-in-law threatened to say goodbye. Who cares about you, you little bogeyman? My son is a fool for paying attention to you. Ruined his life. She didn't even think it was possible to do such a cruel thing. It's all coming to a head. Anne closed the door behind her guests and sat down on the sofa. God, and how could I have been so blind? They were just using me, she sobbed. Anne was going to leave something to her husband after the divorce. His car she definitely wanted to give him. But after what he and his mum had done, she went on principle. The car had been bought with her money, and she could easily prove it. Michael wasn't working at the time, so the truth was on her side. No matter how hard Mrs. Caroline tried, no matter what lawyer she sent to her, they couldn't do anything. Anne, come on, screamed the guests at the wedding. Mr. Jason kept up with her. This time Anne was having all the fun she could. Miss Anne and her husband were always participating in contests. After signing in, they sat down at the table. Mr. Jason held his wife close to him. She kissed him. My happiness. He kept his eyes on her. Anne, darling. Tears came out of his eyes. And then they went on their honeymoon. The newlyweds didn't want to advertise or surprise anyone. They just went on a tour of Europe. God, this stuff is delicious. Anne closed her eyes in pleasure when she tasted real Viennese waffles. She greedily absorbed everything around her. She hadn't realized she was enjoying the story so much. Jason, look at this, she pointed at the medieval temple. They were standing in a square that was surrounded by stunning buildings. The honeymoon had strengthened the couple even more. They chatted for hours on end. Anne had never experienced, even in her dreams, that it was possible to live like this. Mr. Jason was a grown man, so he didn't give Anne a hard time when someone looked at her or wanted to meet her. Where did this one come from? You're not an ice cream. I can't leave you alone for a minute, he grinned. From Namibia. He complimented me on my beauty, he laughed. Sometimes I wish you'd taken off your glasses when you were wearing them. You didn't get hit on so often by suitors, he supported her laughter. And a year after that journey, Anne had a daughter, a tiny baby Elvira. I've always wanted my daughter to be called Elvira, her father shook her contentedly. I think with such a name she will be a real schoolgirl. I can't wait to chase her. You'll complain later. I'd rather she was in the pram asleep. Anne laughed. Look at her, she's already restless. Elvira changed her voice and waved her arms. Well, Fidgety, come here. Anne took her daughter in her arms and pressed her to her chest. No one had ever thought it was possible to play with one's life like this. James walked slowly up the white, worn steps. The bank of the rocky river running through the city was high. He had to climb several flights of stairs to reach the embankment. James was shivering in his old down jacket. It was a real gray November. A piercing wind and icy grains were falling from the sky. Here by the river, the temperature was much lower than in the city. It felt like winter was approaching. James pulled his knitted hat over his ears. There was no way he was going to get sick. If he went to bed, he wouldn't be able to pay for a bed at the hostel. There'd be nothing to buy groceries with, let alone medicine, because the life of a homeless man is like a flood. What can you do? James has seen worse times. He slept on a heating duct and lived in a dumpster, surviving as best he could, but he managed to make it through, more or less get on with his life. Until the fulfillment of the main dream to buy his own home, of course, still far away, but already much better than it was. James grew up in a small village with a speaking name Oaks. Surrounding this place were groves of oaks, especially picturesque in the fall. Little James, as a preschooler, tried to draw them, these beautiful trees. And then, as he grew older, he tried to put what he saw on paper. But it just didn't work. I guess I didn't have enough talent. Childhood is the happiest and coziest time of James' life. The grown man often remembered his early years with nostalgia. And it's not even that. At that time he had a roof over his head, his own bed with clean linen, a guaranteed bowl of soup every day. It's that he was loved then. He wasn't alone. His grandmother, sweet, kind Grandma Patricia, wise, forgiving, warm. It had seemed to James for a long time that she was omnipotent. It was Grandma who always found the right words to dispel her grandson's sadness and anxiety. She was the one who understood what to do in any given situation. She was respected by her neighbors. She seemed to know everything in the world. Also, Grandma was never tired. At least, James couldn't remember her sleeping. When he went to bed, Grandma was still tending to the chores, and when James woke up, she was up and about. Smart, smiling. Grandma was a sturdy woman. Tall, statuesque, energetic. She could not sit idle, always found something to do, worked, maintained the household, and raised her grandson. Yes, a grandmother. This woman did not look like a gray-haired old woman in a sharp scarf. No, James's grandmother was still young, just as he remembered her. Energetic, active, businesslike. Later, James missed her gaze, her warm embrace, her gentle, soothing voice. He sobbed at the impossibility of changing everything. Blaming himself, screaming helplessly into the void. Hopelessness. That's how James would characterize his state of mind. It was not terrible to lose the house. The guy at that time, this moment, was almost not interested. The main thing is that his grandmother was no longer there. James had no other relatives. It happened that way. In villages where almost everyone was a brother-in-law, nephew, or distant relative, it was strange. But what could be done? Grandmother Patricia had come to Oaks as a young girl after her husband, whose name was also James. Grandson was named after his grandfather. He was a good man, kind, hard-working, and skillful. And at work, at the sawmill, he was appreciated and neighbors respected. And James S.R. grew up in an orphanage. He didn't know his family, that's why, probably, he dreamed of creating a strong, big family. Once he went to work in a village almost 100 kilometers away. It's the Pines. It's a remote area. He met a beautiful, modest girl named Patricia. And so it was that they ended up getting married. James and Patricia moved to the Oaks. They became a family at James' house. James worked at his sawmill. Patricia got a job on the farm as a milkmaid. Everything was fine. Everything was fine. All right. They lived soul to soul. Both spouses dreamed of a large family and at least 5 children. But it didn't happen. The couple had a daughter, Hannah. The young parents were not going to stop at this achievement. But the years went by, and Hannah remained the only child in the family. The girl grew up beautiful, not like her mother or father. They were simple country folk, but this was white bone. Fine features, fragile figure, huge violet eyes and golden curls. A princess, indeed. The locals joked about whether Patricia had fattened up such a beauty somewhere in the city. But James had no doubts about his wife's fidelity. The man didn't know his own family and rightly assumed that his daughter had taken after one of his relatives. This was most likely the case. The girl's character matched her appearance. She was smart, capricious, self-loving. And when Hannah grew a little older and realized that she had an attractive appearance, she became proud. Hannah had simple and hardworking parents. Their family lived no worse or better than anyone else. But Hannah was sure that she deserved more. She dreamed of living in a big city and blamed her parents for not bothering to move there in their time. She demanded toys from her mother and father, then outfits and jewelry. She refused to do housework, arguing that she was not going to stay in the countryside for long, and that she needed to study, not sweep floors. Except Hannah wasn't studying. Or rather, she did study, but not at all what they teach in school. She bought magazines and tried to make herself look like one of those models that flashed on the pages of glossy editions. She did makeup, washed and painted a new face again, achieving the perfect result. I learned how to combine closet items correctly, to make different hairstyles out of my golden hair. And it all started when Hannah was about 12. Maybe even a little earlier. "I'll go to the city, become a photo model," she said. "Maybe even go abroad. But I'm not going to live in a shithole like you," Hannah said. Patricia and James looked at each other in confusion. They both blamed themselves for their daughter's behavior. But what had they done wrong? Patricia herself had grown up in absolute poverty, and even starved. That's why probably she tried to please her only daughter, and even a beautiful one at that. James, that in general did not know parental love and was brought up in an orphanage. What can I say? The man, spoiled, of course, long awaited his child. And yet both spouses tried to instill in Hannah basic moral principles. By their example, they showed that it is necessary to work. It is necessary to work. It is necessary to treat others with respect. Patricia taught her daughter to bake pies, to clean the house. Except that the girl from childhood rejected parental attitudes and with all her appearance showed that she dreams of a completely different life. And when she became a teenager, then James and Patricia, that only about themselves, did not listen. And they're losers and they don't think things through. "You have no right to tell me what to do," shouted at her mother and father when they tried to talk some sense into their princess and force her to learn to help them with their chores. "You don't. You've done nothing for yourselves. One works at a sawmill for a penny. The other is a dung shoveler in a barn, and there you go. I'm not like you. I want to live differently, and I will. I'll marry a rich man. Or become a model." "Who'd marry you, you inept girl?" Her father tried to talk some sense into Hannah. "You can't cook or clean. Your mother still takes care of you." "Don't worry about that. I'm not marrying a village idiot. I'm marrying a rich man. They have servants for all that," answered Hannah. Her parents could not change her mind. She became more and more capricious and more angry. She didn't want to study. She didn't help at home. All she had to do was to look at fashion magazines and spend time on the street with her friends. By the way, Hannah had plenty of admirers on the street. But how could such a beautiful girl? And it was not only boys' classmates, but also grown-up guys. That's what scared Patricia the most. They had conversations with her daughter. She just laughed in their faces. James tried to be tough, locking his wayward daughter up at home to keep her out of trouble. But Hannah always escaped, either through the window, or she got a moment when her mother and father were distracted and ran out the door. She wanted company, wanted to see admiring glances, to hear compliments. All this fueled her faith in herself, her confidence in her own irresistibility, even more convinced that she was worthy of some mythical, better life. And in another life, Beauty dreamed of getting to the other life easy way. Studying at school and then at university, she was not interested. The girl believed that it is too long and difficult. This is for those who were unlucky enough to be born a beauty with huge violet eyes and golden curls, she said. All this was told to the grown-up James by his neighbor Claire. She called his mother Hannah Tales. His grandmother, on the other hand, never spoke ill of his mother, only sighed at her fate. Well, she also blamed herself for missing her daughter somewhere. Not looking out, James recalled. Claire, on the other hand, cut the truth straight and didn't try to soften the edges. "Your mother's a beauty, I can't say. But she's lazy. And she wasn't very bright either. She wanted to fly high. She didn't have the brains to do the math. And so it turned out the way it did. It wasn't her grandmother and grandfather's fault. They did everything for their daughter. They're good people. It's probably just genes from Henry's family. That's why he grew up in an orphanage. Who puts their kids in an orphanage like that? Misguided. And only people like Hannah. If it wasn't for Grandma, you'd have had to grow up in an orphanage too. Hannah was barely 18. She ran away from her parents' home, and not to study in the city like many other village boys and girls, but after her fiancé. A guy from the city, a student, and a local boy came to visit them once in Seneki. His friend had come to see his parents, so he brought his fellow student with him. The groom's name was Ethan. He was also a student at the university and already drove his own car. His father had given it to him for his coming of age. Ethan was handsome and stylish, just like an actor from a youth show. Naturally, Hannah immediately met him. The village beauty charmed the young man. They had an instant romance. But Ethan took Hannah to the city. They started living together in his apartment. Ethan was studying, Hannah was a housewife. She didn't even study to get a foothold in the city. Cooking, scrubbing floors, that's all she did. Ethan and Hannah lived a well-to-do fun life thanks to the young man's father's money going out to clubs and restaurants, even traveling. Naturally, James went to the city and tried to bring his wayward daughter home. He understood where this was going, but she flatly refused to go, and there was nothing he could do. Hannah was already 18, so she had the right to run her own life as she saw fit. Hannah had spent too much time in the village. Her parents got her a job as a clerk in the local store, since she didn't want to study. She lived a miserable existence, dreaming of a beautiful life. She was angry at her fate, at her father and mother, at the local village boys who could not fulfill her dreams. What kept her from running away to the city, even to nowhere, were her parents. They were endlessly urging her to get smart, lecturing her, controlling her adult daughter, explaining it all with fear for her future. Hannah would have run away from them without a shame, but where and on what money? The girl tried to send her photos to a modeling agency, but to her own surprise, she did not receive any answers. Hannah thought that the offers would come at her like a cornucopia, but no such luck. She continued to think over the plan, communicated on dating sites, received a lot of compliments and offers, but she was afraid. Hannah hadn't seen these people in person. There's no telling who might be out there on the other side of the monitor. It was her parents who planted those fears in her, which made her hate them even more. And then Ethan showed up, a prince in a black Audi. He rescued the beautiful girl from captivity, took her away from the hated, dirty village, poor parents, moralizing. That's how Hannah perceived her departure. She had escaped, broken free. It didn't work out with Ethan. In the end, he quickly found someone else. But Hannah was in no hurry to return to the village. She had a new beau, lower in status than Major Ethan, but not bad either. That relationship didn't work out either. But a new one loomed ahead. Hannah lowered the bar in the choice of suitors. The suitors changed one after another. One thing remained unchanged: the girl lived at the expense of these people, gave them her tenderness, youth, beauty, and in return received a roof over her head, food, some gifts, trips to cafes and clubs. Life seemed to Hannah not quite what she had dreamed of, but she wasn't going back to the village. James and Patricia were heartbroken to see what their daughter was becoming. Her once golden curls had faded, her voice rough and hoarse. Her skin took on an unhealthy hue. Hannah drank heavily, started smoking. All this, of course, reflected on her health and appearance. James was very worried about the path his only daughter had taken. It was a huge shock to her father. Patricia hoped that Hannah would come to her senses and get her mind right. She'd had enough of such a life with one man, then another. And they were not such wealthy and handsome young men as Ethan. They were more like battered men of marginal appearance. James and Patricia worked somewhere, so they had money, and Hannah lived in the city at the expense of her admirers. She'd been transformed from a golden-haired princess into a gray woman with a dysfunctional appearance. It was hard to imagine that she had once looked so different. She had dreamed of a rich, beautiful life, spent hours perfecting her makeup. Hannah was going downhill fast and didn't seem to notice it at all. She felt happy and didn't want to go back to her parents. James's heart ached for his daughter, literally. The man had suffered 2 heart attacks in a row. Patricia was also worried, of course, but in her heart she hoped that everything would be all right. Hannah was still very young. But James, it seems, realized that nothing good could come out of Hannah. He didn't survive a third heart attack. So Patricia was left all alone in the village house. No husband. Daughters living a wild life in the city. Yeah, it's not how she imagined her old age. At least she had a job. The woman still worked as a milkmaid on the farm. There's socializing, some kind of life there. And at home? Loneliness, cold, four walls. On New Year's Eve, an unprecedented event happened. Hannah came to her mother in the village. Patricia, seeing the dear guest, immediately began to clutter, to collect the table. Her daughter did not look well, pale, swollen face. When Hannah took off her jacket, Patricia gasped. Her belly was rounded under her sweater. Hannah was pregnant, and it looked like she'd been pregnant for a long time. It turned out that the father of the child is another suitor, Hannah Trucker. He rented an apartment in the city, earned good money, enough to live on, and to get drunk when he was not on a trip. Pregnancy, of course, no one planned. It just happened. Learning about what happened, the admirer was frightened. He admitted that he already has a family in another city, a wife and 2 children. He doesn't need heirs on the side. Gave him money to solve the problem. But Hannah was turned away at the hospital. All the terms were out, but there were no indications to terminate the pregnancy, as the child was developing well. It was surprising, considering that Hannah, being pregnant, did not deny herself alcohol. Further, everything was ridiculously banal. The admirer ran away, quickly disappeared. Hannah lived in their apartment for a few more months until the lease was up, but she had nowhere to go. Who would want her? She couldn't get another boyfriend, so she returned to her home village. Patricia hoped things would get better for them now, and the fact that the child will not have a father, so it's not a problem. She would manage, raise him, teach him, put him on his feet. The woman was counting on Hannah's maternal instincts to kick in, to change her and make her softer, more loving, more caring. It didn't work out. Hannah barely survived to give birth in the hated village. By the way, the baby was born prematurely weak and very small. He was nursed in the hospital for almost a month. Hannah immediately gave up her son. She didn't need him. And here and premature, obviously sick. So she gave up the baby at the hospital and went back to the city. Now she could again live in her own pleasure, go to cafes and restaurants in search of new love, have fun without a belly. Everything is better. Everything is easier. After learning about her daughter's deed, Patricia rushed to the maternity hospital, explained the situation to people. She was understood. The refusal documents were canceled. Patricia's neighbor's niece worked there as head doctor. That's how it was resolved through her. But we had to find Hannah. The baby's mother had to be present and sign the paperwork. Hannah at first insisted that she did not need her son, and it would be better for him to go to an orphanage. But Patricia convinced her daughter the boy should stay in the family. She found arguments. I will take care of him. Do not be afraid. Live as you have lived. But you'll get an allowance for him, and a lot of money. You're a single mom. Patricia took this step for her grandson. Convinced her daughter to agree to it because of child support. Otherwise, Hannah would never have kept the baby. And Patricia would not have been given custody, and the conditions are not ideal, and the age is already solid. So little James stayed with his grandmother in the village. His mother, the beautiful Hannah, James knew only from the stories of his grandmother, neighbors, and their photos. The woman was not interested in the fate of the child, only occasionally came to his mother to rest between the next complex novels. A vague image remained in James's memory, a woman who smelled pungent, hoarse, unpleasant. She was yelling at his grandmother, demanding something, and little James was scared. But of course he couldn't remember his parent well, because Hannah had died when he was barely 4. Another roommate in a drunken brawl did not calculate forces. That's how Hannah's life ended quite naturally. His grandmother told James many times that she had survived that period, after Hannah's death, only because of the little grandson she had to take care of. They didn't have much money, times were hard, and a milkmaid's wages were not luxurious. But James considered his childhood happy, energetic, strong, caring grandmother, friends, soft bed, the aroma of pies and fried potatoes. Yes, James did not have an expensive computer, game consoles, branded sneakers, what is considered the ultimate joy for teenagers. But he never went hungry or wore rags. James tried to help his grandmother with everything. Growing up, he realized that life at home and loved one was not easy. Restless boy tried to please her as much as he could. True, to study well did not work. Grandmother engaged with him, tried to explain complex topics, but did not add up something in his head. And that's it, said the neighbor of the grandmother, Claire. That's because Hannah drank while she was carrying him. They were sitting in the kitchen drinking tea and thought James couldn't hear a thing. Yeah, but who cares? Grandma waved her hand. The main thing is that he's healthy, strong, and kind. Not everyone has to be a scientist. And James will find his place in life. He's so handy. Like his grandfather, I suppose. James was really good at fixing things, making things that's him. And no one taught him how to do it on purpose. He watched other people do it and picked it up on the fly. Not like math. By the time James finished school, the financial situation of their small family had completely deteriorated. The farm paid a pittance. His grandmother's pension was also very small, especially compared to the ever-increasing prices. James worked part-time, mending neighbors' fences and cutting people's grass, digging potatoes, even helping to build houses. But the earnings were irregular and small. With those grades and the certificate, James had no sense to think about college, let alone university. But the boy still decided to go to the city. There are more opportunities to earn money there, to settle in life. And his grandmother needs financial help. She's been dragging him down so much already. Go, Patricia said yes. You're a serious guy with a backbone. I'm not as worried about you as I was about Hannah. You won't be lost. You won't go off the straight and narrow. Just be careful. You're still young, and there's so much danger out there. Don't worry, Grandma. James put his arm around his grandmother's shoulders. Everything will be fine. I'll go to the construction site as a laborer. I can knead cement, lay bricks, and plaster and paint. I'm a jack of all trades, in general. I'll definitely find a use for me there. I'll earn for an apartment, and I'll take you right away. Grandmother smiled, but her eyes were still sad, even though she'd said James wouldn't be lost. She must have had a premonition of trouble. The city stunned James at first. Crowds of rushing people, streams of cars. No, the boy, of course, had been to the city before. But it was one thing to come with his grandmother to do some shopping or file some paperwork, and quite another to be here for a long time alone, to become a resident of this noisy metropolis. Where to start? Where to go? James found several advertisements in advance back in the village. At the construction site often needed workers. So he decided to try young, strong. This guy was gladly hired to build another supermarket. The object was almost ready. Finishing works were left. The crew was running out of time. They needed helpers. James fit the bill. He was even provided with accommodation, a caravan hut. True, he had to share it with the workers, but it was nothing, but it was free. Having received the first money, James immediately rented an apartment. He wanted to start looking for a new job, but the job found him. One of the workers, who lived with James in the apartment, called him to the new object. They'll pay well, the bearded man assured him. As soon as we get the results, we'll get the money. James didn't object to this settlement scheme. He had money saved from his previous earnings, so he didn't worry about what he would have to live on all this time. The work was going on, the arguments. James was anticipating that pretty soon he would have some good money. Then he could send some of it to his grandmother. He knew she had debts, borrowing from neighbors to send her grandson to the city. She was afraid to let the guy go without any money at all. Soon he'll pay her back with a raise. She'll be so happy. It didn't work out. This time the owners simply screwed the laborers. Maybe it was the bearded man who took James' money and ran off with it. Maybe he was the cheater, realized James was a naive rookie. It was useless to appeal to the police or the labor inspectorate. No one signed official contracts with the workers. No one would take his word for it. James was in a desperate situation. The money he had set aside had run out. He had no money to pay the rent, and there was almost no money left for bread. James spent days running around the city looking for work. As luck would have it, unskilled laborers were not needed anywhere. And then one day, after another unsuccessful attempt to get a job at a construction site, James wandered towards the bus stop. He was filled with a variety of unpleasant feelings: fear, despair, resentment. And then someone called out to him. "Hey kid, are you looking for a job?" James turned around. Behind him stood two guys about 25 years old, tall, tanned to black. They were construction laborers. They work on the street, hence the calluses, the tanned faces, and the broad palms, glowing with mud. I'm looking. James nodded. And just because we need help. It's not a big deal. Just one thing to unload into a car. But the pay is good. A doubt crept into James's soul. What if he was being deceived again? He didn't want to step on the same toes again. He wanted to try to get an official job. But there was no way out. He had to stay in the city to find a job. You got to pay rent, you got to have money for food. So he decided to take a risk. I'm with you, he said. All right, replied the man. So we'll meet here tonight at 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock tonight, James clarified, and it seemed strange. Why so late? The owners are leaving late. We'll go in after them, start taking everything out. They don't want to be involved in all this fuss, so they're paying well. James shrugged. The rich have their quirks. I'll be there, he promised his new acquaintances. James was there at the right time. The guys he'd arranged with were late, or maybe they wouldn't show up at all. James wouldn't be too upset. Sure, he needed the money, but these men looked too suspicious. There was insincerity in them, falseness. James kept thinking they'd cheat him, not pay him, like the bearded man. But the guys showed up a few minutes late, but they came. Or rather, they arrived when an old, broken-down, open-body truck pulled into the parking lot. James didn't even look at it, didn't even think it was after him. But the driver's door swung open, and one of James' daytime companions looked out. What are you standing there for? Get in. We're already late, he said. James obeyed and got into the seat next to the driver. The other guy was here too. He said a discreet hello and stared out the window again. Unlike his buddy, this second guy was silent and frowning. They drove for a long time, almost an hour, first through the city, then the highway, then a country road. Everything that was happening seemed increasingly suspicious to James, but he realized that at this point there was unlikely to be a quick and easy way out of the case. At best, the two men would drop him off at night without a dime in his pocket somewhere outside the city. At worst. He didn't even want to think about that. The driver was joking now and then, smiling. James had a strong feeling that he was playing the brave guy, trying to seem calm and relaxed, but he was worried. The other was silent, as usual. He didn't react to his buddy's words, just stared at the road. Finally, the truck stopped near a plot of land enclosed by a high fence. The driver opened the gate with a key. James exhaled as long as he had the keys. Then everything was really okay. You stay in the yard. We're going in the house. The driver ordered. We'll be handing you the boxes. You put them in the back of the truck. We'll be done in no time. The boys went into the house. James noted that they also had a key to the front door. It was silent and dark, the kind of darkness that only happened in the countryside. Large stars peered down from the sky. James involuntarily admired the night sky. He thought of his hometown. He thought of his grandmother, wondering what she was doing now. Probably drinking tea with Grandma Claire in the cozy kitchen. And old women were always talking about him, about James. I felt like going home to the only person I'd ever known. He wanted to be a little boy again, for whom his grandmother was a loving and all-powerful being. The driver's hoarse voice interrupted James from his pleasant thoughts. What are you dreaming about? Standing like a pillar, take the box. James obediently dragged the container into the truck as agreed. The box was heavy. I wondered what was inside: books, dishes, maybe just some household stuff. No sooner had James returned to the front porch than the silence of the September night was broken by the wail of a police siren. The darkness was struck by the glow of a flashing beacon. James had hoped that the police cars would drive past the station to the scene of the accident. But they stopped right outside the gate. What happened next happened quickly. James's brain was fixating on individual frames. Here the garden fills with uniformed men. Some of them rush into the house, another part starts to search the plot. James is rolled to the ground lightly, as if he weighs nothing. His arms are twisted painfully behind his back. His face is tickled by dry grasses. Sand is stuffed into his nose and mouth. James sneezes once or twice. It's hard to breathe. Someone roughly turns James' face sideways. The boy gulps greedily for air. On the dark womb of a police van, James sits handcuffed on a hard bench. There are uniformed men nearby. The driver and the other guy are nowhere to be seen. They seem to have escaped. That's what James deduces from the scraps of phrases exchanged between the law. Where are your accomplices? James is approached by a stout man in camouflage. Do you know where they went? James shakes his head negatively. He wants to explain to these people that those who ran away are not his accomplices, that they met for the first time only this morning, that these guys just offered him a job, and James needed the money. But James doesn't say anything. First of all, they're not likely to believe him. The guy replayed his speech in his head and realized it sounds very improbable. Secondly, his tongue became alien from fear, as if it were too big and clumsy. And my mouth was dry. He was very thirsty, but James didn't dare to ask the policeman for water. Do you even know whose cottage you are going to rob? The man in the camouflage turned to the terrified boy again. Samantha's attorney. The summer house. I'll give you assholes the full program now, said the man in camouflage. Then James was interrogated. The investigator, a middle-aged man with a tired, angry look, asked him questions like a hardened criminal. James told the truth. He wasn't believed, of course. Who would have doubted it? The two men had escaped, gone into hiding. They were being searched for. James had assumed that the cops wouldn't succeed. Now, he was sure he'd met experienced criminals. They'd probably get away with it. But what would happen to him? James was sent to the holding cell until morning. Black cell, hard bunks. A very special, indescribable odor. A calm and silent neighbor who didn't even ask what James was in jail for. All day long, the big, scowling man lay on his shelf and stared at the ceiling. Sometimes he would be taken somewhere, and then James would be alone. It turned out that the truck the thieves had come to get him in had been reported stolen. They decided to pin it on James, too. There was no use explaining to the men in uniform that James couldn't drive a car. I haven't had time to learn. I don't even have a license. It's easy to check, he said. We've got half the country driving without a license. That's not a handicap, he replied. The trial was held unexpectedly quickly. Only a few days after the arrest, the grandmother was present at the hearing. She had been informed in time. James didn't expect to see her. He was in the defendant's seat. All the evidence was against him. He was ashamed to look his grandmother in the eye, even though James realized that he was not guilty of anything. But his grandmother doesn't know. She must think he's a criminal. Grandma looked thin and old all at once. There were shadows under her eyes. There were more wrinkles. Her gaze was troubled, sad, but loving. She looked at James without judgment, with tenderness and love. It gave the boy strength. When the judge announced the verdict, James' eyes darkened. He realized he wouldn't be acquitted, but he had hoped for a much lighter sentence. He even secretly wished for house arrest. He wasn't a repeat offender, after all. 8 years in a strict regime colony, the judge's verdict sounded ruthlessly. Grandma gasped, clutched her heart, and grew old before her eyes. So what is it? He's a child, he almost stumbled. He was confused by adult criminals. They tricked him and ran away. It's clear as day, she wailed. And James went to a colony in another region. The long gray days dragged on like twins. Wake up, a meager breakfast, work in the industrial zone, a walk in the cramped prison yard, sometimes searches and inspections. Lunch, dinner, periodic medical examinations. Occasional holidays for the prisoners. The dreary monotony, the peculiar odor, the filth, the despair, the fear. James was always lucky with his neighbors. They were much more human than the guards. Each had his own complicated fate. James, as the youngest, was even pitied in his own way. They realized that it was bad luck for a young, naive boy to meet dangerous people on his way. James now had a lot of time to think. He was going through his universities, getting to know people, getting to know life. Now the guy was clearly realizing how naive and stupid he had been. James wouldn't fall for such a trick again. He'd do things differently. But you don't fight back. Sometimes James had a visit from his grandmother. Each visit, James noticed new wrinkles on her face. The boy was getting older, and his grandmother was getting older. James knew that she now had heart problems, and he realized who was responsible for the illness of his own. Of course, worrying about his grandson did its job, rewarded the grandmother with a serious ailment. She needed an operation, but it cost money. And where to get it? James knew that the grandmother had tried several times to appeal for leniency for her grandson, even hired lawyers. But it hadn't worked out. James had answered to the full extent of the law, and only because the victims included a prosecutor. And those people are known to have a lot of connections. How many times during these 8 years James dreamed of going back to that unfortunate day and refused the offer of 2 strangers to earn money? His whole life would have turned out differently. "It's okay, grandson." With everything happens, calmed his grandmother. "Calm down, everything will be all right." James tried to be brave in front of her. But she saw everything, understood everything. "You've been duped, it's all right. The price is high, but it's just the beginning of life. When you get out, we'll make up for it. Everything will be fine," she said. James smiled. His grandmother's words made him feel lighter and warmer. And it really did feel like everything would work out. The main thing was that he had someone who loved him, who waited, who would never deceive or betray him. And then his grandmother suddenly disappeared. James was worried when she didn't show up for his birthday. Usually she always showed up by that date, and then there was no sign of her. His grandmother's phone didn't answer. James asked the guards several times for permission to use his cell phone. The guards were kind people too, even though they weren't supposed to be. They let the prisoners make calls. But these calls were useless. Just long beeps, that's all. And then James finally got called to the visiting room. The guy flew there like he was on wings. He was relieved. He imagined hugging his grandmother, telling her he missed her so much. But on the familiar gray sofa sat his neighbor, Grandma Claire. She was tense, anxious. "Hello, James," she said, hugging her neighbor awkwardly. "You've lost a lot of weight. Don't they feed you here?" Then, in a broken voice, wiping her eyes with her handkerchief, Grandma Claire told James the terrible news. "Patricia's dead. She had a heart attack. So the ambulance didn't get here in time. How was I supposed to wait for you? I was dreaming, making plans," sobbed Grandma Claire. You could see that she had not yet come to terms with the loss of her friend neighbor. "I couldn't wait. The neighbors organized the funeral. I thought someone was trying to get you to go and say goodbye to your grandmother. No way. It's not allowed, that's all. Not that they didn't let me go. They didn't even tell me about the tragedy." "How come? How could it be?" James mumbled. "How can I come home and she's gone?" "There's nowhere to go." Claire looked at him confused. "Don't you know that?" It turns out that after James went to prison, Grandma Patricia had taken out a lot of loans. Thought a good lawyer would get her favorite grandson out of jail. Only it didn't work out, even with good lawyers. The loans were secured against the house. Consequently, when the owner died, the property went to the bank. It was another blow, much less sensitive than the first, but still. The house isn't just a house. It's James's place of power. A quiet, cozy harbor with which the guy has a lot of pleasant associations, warm memories. And now what? Someone alien would live there. Since then, James felt lonely and not needed by anyone. No grandmother. Then why is he on this earth? What for? He used to think to please his grandmother, to watch over her in her old age. He was working hard for her, striving for something. Now what's it all for? But you've got to make a living. So James adapted to the cold and darkness of prison. He ate, slept, worked, everything was automatic. His mind was constantly replaying scenes from his childhood, when his grandmother was still young and strong. And he promised her that he would support his grandmother in her old age. But the grandmother never lived to be old. Liberation did not bring the expected joy. Rather the opposite. Where to go, what to do, where to sleep, what to eat. There were more questions than answers. At least James had a small amount of money saved up over the years of working in the industrial zone. He went to the city with it. Where else? He's bruised. James realized that no one was waiting for him in the village. Even though Grandma Claire said she'd be willing to take him in, She invited him to visit her after his release, but the guy realized that these were just polite words. Why would she want a felon in her house? In the city, James spent money on hotel and food. The savings melted away in a week, but it was also the beginning of hard times. There were a lot of things and had to sleep on the street and get into street fights and eat from the dumpster. James got sick a couple times, so he thought he'd never make it, and even was glad of this outcome. But the young body recovered again and again, and no one needed gray, dull, joyless life continued. James tried begging. He got a serious beating for it. It turned out to be a whole business, and you can't just enter it by choice. The guy went through the dumpsters and the bins near restaurants and cafes. There was always something to eat, and in the city dump you could find clothes in season. James didn't even want to think about what he'd become. A dirty, ragged bum. If his grandmother had seen him. No, this wasn't how he'd imagined growing up. He was disgusted with himself. Then one day James was walking past a house under construction and noticed that the workers weren't laying the tiles correctly. It turned out that not all the construction skills were out of his head yet. The foreman was surprised, looking at the homeless man incredulously. Then followed his advice, appreciated the result, smiled, and the unbelievable happened. James was offered a job. Of course, he jumped at the opportunity. The foreman's name was Henry. He had his own small construction company. The guys were engaged in minor repairs, construction of small buildings, and the crew needed some smart guys. So James got a job. The pay, of course, was not much, but the man was happy about it. After so many years of hunger and wandering, a permanent job seemed like a gift from fate. Henry appreciated James for his diligence and dexterity. Over time, he learned the young man's story and helped him settle into life a little. For example, he told him that it was not necessary to rent a whole apartment or live in a hotel. It was too expensive. It is much more profitable in James's position to sleep in a hostel. It turns out that in the city there are such budget lodgings, huge rooms filled with bunk beds. To rent a place for the night in such an establishment cost a penny. Now James was falling asleep in a warm bed. Dozens of neighbors snored around him, but that didn't bother the man, who was used to much harsher conditions. James had a job to do. He no longer slept outside, and Henry had become something of a mentor to the man who'd been thrown to the wayside, helping him with paperwork, big purchases, hospitalizations, and so on. Henry advised James to start saving for his own place. You can't stay in a hostel forever. A man needs his own place, even if not a luxurious apartment, but at least a small one on the outskirts, so that there was a place to lay his head. And James began to save little by little, month by month. The man always kept his savings with him. He made a secret pocket in his shirt. When Henry found out about it, he grabbed his head. Are you out of your mind? Who does that? How? James didn't understand. Where am I supposed to leave them? Like burying a treasure in the ground in the woods? Not as treasure, but as a deposit. You and I are going to open a bank account. James was afraid to entrust his hard-earned money to a bank. He'd been cheated many times in his life, and brutally so, but Henry convinced him. And now homeless James even had his own account. The man funded it with regularity. The numbers kept climbing. Someday James would be able to realize his dream and buy a house or an apartment. Living in a hostel had its advantages. James often met a variety of people. Amazing fates, sometimes complicated, sometimes even scary. Lots of different stories. People in the hostel were like fellow travelers on trains, generously sharing details of their life stories with each other. It was fascinating. James regretted that he'd never learned to read and write. If he had been able to write well, he would have published a thick collection of stories. People would be interested in reading about the lives of others. Some of the stories were a veritable treasure trove of wisdom and experience. One day, the bunk shelf next to James's bed was occupied by a new neighbor. He was a man a little older than James himself. He didn't come alone, but with a boy about 6 years old. The child and the man looked uncannily alike. The same green eyes with a slightly sly squint, copper-red hair, and a face and hands like pushkins. It's clear at once father and son. Henry and Louis is small. Louis, like most of the hostel's permanent residents, had a hard history with these people. James recognized it around the third, fourth day of being neighbors with the red-haired couple. Henry, much like James, had grown up in the village. He had been raised by his mother. The man never knew his father. They lived poorly, but they didn't starve. There was always food in the house. His mother worked, Henry studied, tried hard. He had a dream of becoming a lawyer. It seemed to the boy that people in this profession are practically heavenly. They help resolve disputes, do justice, and, importantly, earn good money, so they can afford an apartment in a big city, a beautiful car, travel to the sea. "You see, I wanted to take my mother to the sea," Henry told James in a confidential whisper. The lights were off in the room. There was the sound of snoring coming from the many bunks in the hostel. Little Louis was asleep too, curled up under the blanket. Henry and James were having a conversation. A pleasant, almost friendly conversation. James told his neighbor about his fate. It happened by itself, simply and naturally. And Henry responded with frankness to frankness. Henry realized that it was hard for his mother to carry him alone. He wished he could grow up, get on his feet, make her life a fairy tale. Mother had never been to the sea. She couldn't pay for such a trip, but she dreamed of going. Henry saw she watched movies about the sea, took a long look at pictures of acquaintances from beach vacations. I think she even dreamed about the sea. Anyway, Henry entered college to study law, went to the city, settled in a dormitory. His mother stayed in the village. The boy's dreams were shattered gradually. He learned that lawyers are not always on the side of truth. Often you have to adjust to the situation, to people. This was discovered in practice in court, and the tasks that are solved by representatives of this profession often have nothing to do with something heroic. The majority of lawyers are engaged in real estate registration or at all papers or going through in offices for pennies. That's how one of the college professors put it. And Henry had no reason not to trust him. The kid's down. He thought it was worth it to enroll, and that's it. Fate was settled. A happy future was guaranteed. But no. Still, Henry tried, he studied. After all, there were other lawyers, fighters for justice, defenders of the wronged and oppressed. It was hard to break through, of course, but there's always a chance. A small one, though. The older Henry grew, the clearer he realized that everywhere you need connections and money. And he, a country boy, had neither. Henry finished his college and got a job in the housing and utilities sector, working for a pittance, just as the teacher had predicted. There were plenty of lawyers looking for work at the time, so the inexperienced college graduate was glad to have the job. Now he's on the labor exchange. He rented a room in a dormitory and adjusted his life. His mother was happy for her son. After all, in the city he got a grip, made his way. She was the only person who believed in Henry's brilliant future. And this faith kept the guy afloat, forced him to move forward. He worked in the housing and utilities sector, but was looking for more interesting options. No luck, though. All the good jobs were occupied firmly and for a long time. It seems that there were even queues of the right people for them. But Henry tried not to be discouraged. He had little doubt that sooner or later luck would smile on him. And then his mother died. Henry lowered his head. Even in the semi-darkness, James could see that the man was barely holding back tears. It was obvious that the wound had not yet healed. The heart. And as the doctor said later, he should have gone to the hospital for surgery a long time ago. And Mom. She kept thinking it would go away, taking pills, putting off going to the hospital. I know why they wouldn't let her off work. No, of course they would have. Sick leave, sick leave. But while she was getting treatment, they would have fired her somehow. They'd find a way. It's happened in our village before. Everyone needs healthy young workers. And Mom? She was afraid of being left without money because she had no one to rely on. I was no good as a protector and benefactor. I was barely making ends meet myself. How could I blame myself for that? For not being my mother's rock. I didn't have the time. Henry was taking the loss hard. The realization came gradually. James understood his stablemate as well as anyone. Henry's story seemed to take him back to the time when he was suddenly without his grandmother. James had felt the same way, and he too had blamed himself endlessly for not keeping his loved ones safe. I don't know what would have happened to me in the end, Henry continued. Maybe I would have lived like a robot. Maybe I would have done something stupid. All sorts of thoughts were running through my head at the time. It's hard to even think about it now. But then Shelley came into my life, and everything started to, I don't even know how to explain it. Anyway, she got me out. Shelley got a job as a janitor at the same utility company where Henry worked. She was a sweet, modest girl with constantly troubled gray eyes framed by fluffy eyelashes. Henry didn't notice her at first. Newcomers often showed up and then left. The turnover was due to a combination of heavy workloads, neglectful bosses, and very modest salaries. But one day the guy literally bumped into Shelley in the hallway. He was in a hurry to get to the next office and bumped into a girl moving toward him. How did he not notice? Shelley gasped. Henry grabbed her by the shoulders, holding her up so she wouldn't fall. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. He was about to continue on his way when he saw her eyes. No, of course, Henry had met Shelley before in the yard at work, in line at the cash register, and in general. He'd glimpsed her in the cafeteria, but he'd never noticed her. After his mother's death, everything around him was gray and inexpressive. There was little that interested Henry, little that attracted his attention. But those eyes were bottomless lakes, impossible to look away from. Touching eyes like a Disney cartoon. So much anxiety in them, so much awe. Henry suddenly felt like someone strong, confident, almost omnipotent. He wanted to be near her, to take care of her, to protect her from the dangers of this life. For the first time since the tragedy, the boys suddenly felt alive. They stopped right there in the corridor. Each of them had forgotten where they were going. Henry apologized for running into the girl, smiled. Shelley began to assure him it was no big deal, word by word, and somehow the young people agreed to go on their first date. That's the story of an acquaintance. It soon became clear that Shelley and Henry had a lot in common. First, they were the same age. Secondly, at their young ages, both are already having to make their own way in this life. Neither Shelley nor Henry had any older relatives ready to help them in life, to become mentors and support, or close friends. That's just the way it is. Shelley grew up in an orphanage. She knew nothing about her parents except that both were alcoholics on the street. That's the characterization the teacher used when she told the girl about her past. The child was taken away from the marginalized couple because the girl was in danger with her parents. Did these people love her? Were they trying to bring her back? Shelley didn't know for sure, but she assumed not. Because if to other pupils at least sometimes someone came swollen, unkempt mothers with dirty lollipops, strange-looking homeless fathers, decrepit grandmothers lowered, lost, but still relatives and not indifferent people, then Shelley in general nobody and never visited. And she wanted to see her own, to feel their love. The girl would forgive these people everything, would accept them and understand. But no one came. Life in the orphanage was not easy. Cruel children, angry teachers. Quiet, humble Shelley had a hard time. She lived her life waiting for the next blow, the next bullying. The kids sensed the quiet ones and used them for their own amusement. Shelley was locked in a dark bathroom at night. She was robbed of New Year's gifts donated to orphanages from the city government. Her clothes were often stained with paint or plasticine. More than once Shelley was beaten just to show her strength and superiority. And the girl could neither fight back nor complain. One day Shelley told the teachers about the bullying of her peers. She herself was blamed. Adults said that she needed to be more communicative. She needed to find a common language with other people, scared her with diagnoses. But the offenders were punished. But Shelley didn't feel any better. On the contrary, she was then spotted in the yard, dragged behind the gazebo and beaten again for complaining. The girl never asked adults for help again. Shelley didn't study very well, and she would have liked to be an excellent student. She reached for knowledge, read a lot, but it did not work. It was impossible to learn her lessons. Other pupils interfered, they made noise, molested, and even, sometimes, took away notebooks and textbooks. In the orphanage, striving for knowledge and diligent study was considered something shameful. Shelley was called a nerd. Bookworm was demeaned. In general, no one in the orphanage really studied, and the teachers gave lessons for a tick. Once Shelley even heard a conversation between teachers. The math teacher contemptuously threw the teacher of Russian, "Why are you prostrating yourself in front of these morons? They won't be of any use anyway. They'll follow in the footsteps of their miserable parents, or bruises won't be born oranges." Shelley had tears in her eyes. Is that how they treat them? No. She'd known before that the orphanage's residents weren't particularly favored. But it was one thing to assume, but it was another to hear herself say it. The worst part was, Shelley knew the teacher was right. That's just the way it is. Probably having overheard that conversation, Shelley realized it's not worth dreaming about happiness, about a bright future. Nothing good was going to happen to her, and she shouldn't even try. Shelley went to college to become a pastry chef. She studied, knowing full well that she was unlikely to find a place in her specialty. It was too narrow a specialty, and she wasn't very good at it. Her hands did not obey well and could not repeat the operations that the teachers showed her. Shelley realized at the beginning that this was not her path, but all the orphans, their girls, were sent to learn to be pastry chefs. So she was sent. "It's okay," the group's supervisor, an unexpectedly warm-hearted, caring woman, reassured her. She somehow immediately took to Shelley, took pity on her, which was quite unusual. Not many people work in the profession. "You'll find yourself in life now. Girl, don't worry." Having reached adulthood, Shelley graduated from the orphanage. It was a day she greeted with joy. Deliverance at last. A confusing adult life lay ahead. Now she'd have to make her own way. No one is responsible for her now. But at least the end of bullying peers and cruel punishments of educators. Shelley was given an apartment on the outskirts of town by the state. It's an old, 3-story house. Creaky floors, piles of garbage. The room was tiny, but it was her own place. An island of tranquility where Shelley found herself a full-fledged mistress. At first, the girl was even dizzy. She could do whatever she wanted, cook something delicious in her own kitchen, lie in bed and read without fear that someone would take her book away from her, watch late into the night on a hand-bought TV, an old, cracked screen. So what? It works. For the first time, Shelley lived on the money that had accumulated in her account during her stay in the orphanage. Each pupil received a certain amount of money, but the graduates were warned that they had to find a job before the savings ran out. Shelley knew it was really important. She'd seen how fast the money was being spent, especially since at first she was inexperienced and didn't know how to save money. Then she learned how to save money. As Shelley expected, she couldn't get a job as a pastry chef, and it wasn't her profession. The girl understood everything about herself and evaluated her skills quite adequately. Fortunately, there were many other options. Shelley tried to work as a cashier in a supermarket, but it didn't work out. It required quickness, somewhere assertiveness, boldness, somewhere even the skill of a psychologist. Shelley couldn't count money fast enough, she couldn't serve customers quickly, and everyone was always dissatisfied with her. And at the end of the shift, Shelley had a shortage, which was deducted, of course, from her salary. As a result, the girl received pennies, which were not even enough for food. It was good that her orphan savings had not been completely used up yet, and one day Shelley owed her master a month's wages. The salary wasn't enough to cover the shortfall, so Shelley quit her job to stay out of trouble. There's no telling what kind of shortage she'll get next time. Shelley started looking for work again. Now her situation was desperate. She had no money at all. Luckily, her neighbor Olivia helped. She told her that the utility company was looking for janitors. Shelley, without hesitation, grabbed the offer. About the work of a janitor, the girl at that time had the vaguest ideas. Already in the course of business, Shelley realized that this work is to her liking. It's nice to spend time in the fresh air. It's nice to communicate with the residents of the house. It's nice to make the territory cleaner. It's nice to hear the words of gratitude for the timely removal of dry leaves and sanded, slippery paths. Fate prepared another surprise. It brought Henry together. Young people who were all alone in the world suddenly found each other, and it was happiness for both of them. Henry and Shelley didn't meet for long. A couple of months after they met, they had already formalized their relationship and started living together in a small apartment. Shelley was happy to have Henry's hand as a man, and the house became even cozier and more comfortable. The young husband had split the ceilings, painted the walls, fixed a long leaking faucet, even replaced the wiring. He loved fixing up their dwelling. Shelley took care of Henry, cooked him delicious lunches and dinners, ironed his shirts, and most importantly, was interested in how his day was going. Perhaps that was the most enjoyable part. Both Shelley and Henry felt important, needed, loved. Now they were not alone on the entire planet. Life took on a whole new color. And then a wonderful thing happened. Shelley told her husband that she was expecting a child. The couple didn't seem to be planning an heir so soon. But the news made them both happy, of course, and it was scary how they would cope with the baby. They do not have anyone who would help, who would prompt, and whether they have enough money for such a luxury. And yet joyful emotions clearly prevailed in the range of stormy feelings of the future parents. Henry took a risky step. He quit his job at the housing and utilities company, which paid pennies, and got a job as a lawyer for a private lawyer. The latter offered him a much more respectable salary, but also more work. He had to study a lot, to understand the nuances of complicated cases, to sit in the office late into the night. Henry did it so that Shelley could quit her job. He rightly believed that the physical labor of janitorial work could be bad for the pregnancy. The man's salary was now quite high, but he was a private citizen. His business had its ups and downs and was sometimes jeopardized. Still, Henry didn't regret his decision. Shelley settled down at home and took over the household. Both spouses looked forward to the arrival of the baby. And then he was born small, warm, shrieking from the first days, looking remarkably like his father, the same green eyes and red hair. Shelley and Henry melted into the care of the baby. The boy was named Louis. Shelley had decided that. It was the name of one of her favorite book characters. Henry didn't mind Louis, a wonderful name. It turned out that a baby was really quite expensive: diapers, special food, clothes that the baby grew out of lightning fast. Not to mention medicines, strollers, cribs, toys. Henry was getting by. He worked hard just so his family wouldn't need anything. They had food, they had necessities. They paid their rent. Of course, the young family couldn't afford anything extra. Trips to the sea, dinners in restaurants, expensive gadgets, all this was still inaccessible. But the spouses were not discouraged. It seemed to both of them that everything was still ahead of them. Shelley was busy with the baby in the house. Henry was working, and all would have been well, except that with Louis' arrival, Shelley's cramped apartment had become a mess. Not only did the number of tenants increase, but also the amount of stuff. Soon the couple realized they needed to expand. Louis was growing up. He needed more and more space, ideally his own room. A studio apartment would do, but then at least it would be newer and more spacious. And the family didn't particularly like the neighborhood. School and kindergarten were far away. The nearest bus stop was also about a 15-minute walk away. That's okay in the summer, but in the winter, it's a long walk. So Henry and Shelley thought about it and decided they needed a mortgage. The money for the down payment could be obtained from the sale of Shelley's cramped old apartment and Henry's country house, inherited from his mother. Of course, it was a risky endeavor, losing the whole place and going into debt all at once. But Henry had a good salary at the time. Louis was getting older, and the time was approaching when Shelley would be able to go to work. The payment seemed manageable to the couple. And so it began. At first, everything was going just fine. They found buyers quickly, even for the farmhouse, although Henry sensed big problems with it. The proceeds went partly toward the down payment on the mortgage, partly toward renovations. Shelley and Henry took a spacious one-bedroom apartment in a new neighborhood, bright, clean, and no one had ever lived in it before. The renovation was done quickly. They had the money. They furnished the rooms with inexpensive but fresh and modern furniture. They hung beautiful curtains and decorated the walls with framed photographs. The pictures were of Shelley, Henry, and little Louis. Henry liked to remember the first New Year's Eve in the new place. They had just finished remodeling. The room still had that distinctive smell of glue and new furniture straight from the store. Beautiful, clean, cozy. A huge, almost ceiling-high Christmas tree occupied the corner of the living room near the window. Little Louis, in his funny pajamas, stared mesmerized at the flashing lights of the garlands that decorated the fluffy beauty. The overhead lights went out. The garlands and the flickering TV screen created a cozy, almost fairy tale atmosphere. Henry looked at his wife and son sitting on the couch and at the neatly set table with incredibly tasty dishes: potatoes and chicken, salads, fruit, and of course champagne. What's New Year's Eve without champagne? At that moment, Henry felt happy and peaceful. His favorite relatives were nearby. It seemed that things would only get better from now on. Henry was pleased with himself. He had done it all. He had succeeded. What he had never dreamed of had come true. On that magical, calm evening, the couple had no idea what trials fate was already preparing for them. It all began the very next year. Louise grew up to kindergarten. The baby got used to preschool surprisingly easily. no caprices and tantrums, no endless illnesses, which frightened young parents of acquaintances. Everything went smoothly. Shelley went to work. She was lucky she was hired as a kitchen assistant in a restaurant. The work was not particularly hard and responsible, and the salary was much higher than that of a janitor. The mortgage payment was a big part of the family's expenses, so the extra money came in handy. Then, in the fall, misfortunes fell upon Shelley and Henry one after another. The blossoming young woman suddenly began to weaken. Dizziness, nausea, loss of appetite. At first, Alan and Shelley assumed pregnancy. Both were afraid they were not yet ready for a second child, primarily financially. The couple realized they couldn't afford it, but there was no question of getting rid of the baby. In general, they gathered their courage and went to the doctor. In the women's counseling, couple was shocked no pregnancy, but Shelley's tests turned out to be alarming. The woman was strongly recommended to be examined by a therapist. Shelley, of course, made an appointment. The examinations took up a lot of her time and energy. She had to constantly take time off from work, which of course did not please her boss. During this period, his wife's eyes were guilty, anxious, and confused. Henry's heart shrank with pity when he looked at his wife. But the man still believed that everything would be all right. A vitamin deficiency or a malfunctioning organ? No problem, they would find the cause, treat it, and everything would be as before. The diagnosis sounded like a thunderclap, the rarest blood disease, presumably hereditary. Shelley couldn't check the doctor's guess. She didn't know anything about her relatives. And what did it matter where the disease came from? The main thing was that the treatment was long, expensive, and there was no guarantee. Doctors with ruthless truthfulness immediately outlined the most likely scenario. Most likely the disease, despite treatment, will progress. All medical manipulations can only briefly delay the inevitable. Shelley was quite resistant to her diagnosis, or maybe she was just pretending to be, braving it for the sake of her husband and son. Henry, on the other hand, felt like he'd been hit over the head with a sandbag. For a long time he felt stunned, completely disoriented. How could it be? Where had the trouble come from all of a sudden? After all, they had just made it out, just started a new life. They had so many plans, so many wonderful ideas. Then Henry came to his senses, accepted the situation, and began to act. First of all, Henry began to look for doctors who had experience in treating patients like his wife. It wasn't cheap, to put it mildly. He had to sell a few things, take out some loans. And then there was the mortgage. Henry was working alone again. Shelley was weakened, and the treatment was taking up most of her time. Louis was happy, not sick, well-behaved, more and more conscious and independent. He understood that Mom was sick, Dad had to work a lot, and learned to serve himself, to dress, cook breakfast, make sandwiches. The little boy grew up before his eyes. People around him praised Louis, setting him as an example to their children. Henry wished all this had never happened. He wished his son didn't know how to tie his shoelaces or make an omelet like other kids his age. Shelley wasn't helped by the medical treatment they could afford. The family went into debt, but it was all for nothing. The young woman was fading, a pale shadow of herself. Henry pounded the thresholds of charitable foundations, tried to get the advice of eminent professors. The latter sometimes succeeded. Only these luminaries of medicine divorced their hands. Shelley's disease was poorly understood, unpredictable. No one knew how to help the young woman. Conventional treatments had little effect on her. Eventually, Shelley was admitted to an inpatient hospital. At that point, she had been sick for about 3 years. The woman couldn't even eat anymore, she was so weak. Henry prepared for a long struggle, even found a nurse who would take care of his wife more carefully for a fee. It didn't work. Shelley didn't live 24 hours after she was admitted to the hospital. Henry couldn't believe what had happened. He was once again experiencing a terrible, unfair loss. The situation was made worse by the fact that the man was now responsible for more than just himself. He had a son. And Louis somehow had to explain that his mother was gone. And then another blow, Henry lost his job. The law firm where he'd worked for the last few years went bankrupt. The owner of the company was always on the edge, taking risks for big profits. So he miscalculated one day. So Henry was also out of a job. After all, during Shelley's illness, the family had accumulated a lot of debts, and the mortgage payment was a heavy burden. Henry found a new job. It paid much less, but there was no other way out. It's not easy to get a good job. That time Henry was lucky to find a high-paying job. or unlucky because his earnings were so unstable. The man worked in the office during the day, and in the evenings he worked part-time. He would help unload a truck at the store, or take part in repairs. Luis was left to his own devices all this time. He did not complain. The boy could always occupy himself. Louis liked to draw. He would take pencils or paints, a sheet of paper, and as if he was disconnected from reality. He went away from the gray reality and created whole worlds with bright rainbows, dense forests, and cute creatures with big eyes, the kind you don't meet in real life. Henry didn't worry about his son going hungry. The main thing was to have something in the refrigerator: bread, sausage, eggs, milk, frozen dumplings. Luis was fine with lunch and dinner. He also fed his father, who was tired after work. That's how they lived. Until it turned out that the apartment was going to the bank for debt. At that time, there were overdue mortgages and loans, so they asked the man and his child to vacate the premises. Henry, as a lawyer, tried to fight for his property. He filed for bankruptcy, tried to explain his plight to people, to no avail. In the end, to avoid the attention of the child welfare authorities, he had to accept it. That's how Henry and Louis ended up at the hostel. James immediately made friends with them. He liked the honest, hard-working Henry. He liked Louis, who was so serious and mature for his 6 years. The three of them became buddies, or even friends, and often had dinner together. James occasionally took Louis for walks. Henry worked a lot, and sitting in a dark hostel was boring for the child. So James took Louis for walks. They talked about everything in the world, discussed different situations, told each other something about themselves. James learned that Louis really wants to become an artist. But the little boy realized that to do that, he had to study. Also, Louis knew that his father did not have money and time to take him to circles or to art school. And that made Louis sad. But the kid did not lose heart, thinking that he would go to the first grade, and there would probably be free classes for students. School was just around the corner, less than a year away. If Louis was looking forward to the start of school with joyful anticipation, his father feared the moment. Because then his and Louis' small homeless family was guaranteed to be on the radar of the child welfare authorities. A child should have a home, a workplace, a bed. And little Louis is living in a hostel. Basically, he's wandering around with his homeless father. Of course, no one's going to leave the boy with a loser parent. They'll take him to an orphanage. Henry knew all too well what it was like there. Shelley had told him enough for the man to try his best to avoid the same scenario for his own child. Except he didn't have the strength, and there was no help. Henry was willing to work, to toil at several jobs, which he actually did. But all these efforts did not bring the desired result. It was still a long way from buying his own place. Henry had some savings, but not enough for even a fraction of the down payment. In short, the situation was desperate. James cringed at the icy wind, or at the sudden rush of thoughts, memories. It wasn't a gentle fall, more like winter. The snow would fall. It would become brighter, more beautiful, softer. Little Louise was looking forward to the new year, to receive presents, to sit at the festive table, to make a wish. He's an adult now. Louise is independent. But still a child, still quite a boy, sincerely believed that the wish made under the chimes would come true. And James knew perfectly well what he would ask Santa Claus or someone else for. In fact, he knew exactly what little Louis was wishing for. The boy would ask for an apartment for him and his dad, and an art school for himself. It's just a shame none of those things will come true anytime soon. James is going to get Louis something he'll love. Already picked up a young artist's kit at the store. Expensive, of course, but nothing's too good for Louis. A suitcase, an easel with a set of paints, pencils, and felt-tip pens. The anticipation of Louis's eyes lighting up at the sight of this splendor made James feel warm. It was so nice to please the people around him, and the children twice as much. But this miracle suitcase would not solve the problems of the little boy and his father, only partially brighten up the gray everyday life of the child. At least that's it. James finally climbed from the bridge to the embankment. Now he was walking along the parapet, in a hurry to get to work. There was no way he could be late. Henry valued him, among other things, for his diligence and reliability. He didn't want to let the man down. And then James noticed that people were standing by the lantern. Men and women, teenagers, children. They were talking excitedly, some were making phone calls, some were filming something on their phones. James followed the gazes of these people. He was stunned. He had never expected to see such a thing. In the dark waves of the wide river, 50 meters from the shore, there was something, or rather, someone. A human head emerged from under the water and then disappeared again. This someone was drowning. He had no strength left. There was no time to speculate about how the man had gotten into the river at a time like this. James, not giving himself time to think over the desperate act, had already swung over the parapet. The man sped across the strip of beach, sand packed into his sneakers, rolled up his pants. The man ran to the water's edge, threw off his jacket, sweater, shoes. It's all heavier. In the cold waves of the river, it would be extra ballast. James was an excellent swimmer. The river was very close to his village. As a child, he used to spend days there with the local boys, swimming and diving and just splashing and frolicking. James, at 5 or 6 years old, felt like a fish in water. Such a pun. But of course, the man never went into the river in this weather. Cold wind and a strong current. And he'd never rescued a drowning man before. But James realized that if he didn't try to pull this man out, no one would help him. And then how to live with it. He had to at least try. The man very well imagined now the despair of a drowning man. There are so many people around, but they are all just watching. Someone's calling the rescue team. Will they make it in time? It's a matter of seconds. The icy water burned his feet. James shivered, but stepped forward. He knew it would be cold at first, and then his body would adapt. And so it did. And now the man is already approaching the drowning man with powerful rows. It is hard to swim strong current, wind, and there is a lot of garbage in the water. Some branches, snags, tina, elderly fangs of algae. James had less and less strength, but he could see his goal. A head of dark hair, he was close enough to get a good look at the person. It appeared to be a young girl, or even a child. Pale face, eyes black with despair and horror. The drowning woman was struggling for life with her last strength. She must have been a good swimmer, or she would have gone under long ago. But in any case, if James didn't hurry, she would. Finally, the man was close by. He swam up behind the girl. A needed knowledge rose from somewhere from the depths of memory. Drowning people in a desperate attempt to survive are even capable of drowning their saviors. That's why James kept his distance. Good thing the girl had long hair. James grabbed hold of it and swam to the shore. The girl felt help coming. At first, she wanted to reach for James to claw at him, but he wouldn't let go. Then the girl sort of realized what was happening, even relaxed a little and let herself be pulled out. Yeah, she wasn't going to be able to handle the current alone. The girl seemed very thin, almost transparent. Already on the shore, silently looking into the face of her rescuer, the poor girl lost consciousness. Here they were already waiting. Someone wrapped James in a plaid. Someone else covered the girl. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance. The man looked around and realized everything was going to be okay now. Only then his hands trembled, and for some reason his teeth chattered. Whether it was the cold or the fear, James had almost lost the girl, and he might not have made it out at this water temperature. The focus of everyone's attention shifted to the girl. The doctors arrived, and from somewhere came an anxious tall man dressed in an expensive leather jacket. It seemed to be the girl's father. At least they both had the same hazel-colored eyes, dark blonde hair, large nose, and defined cheekbones. James didn't wait for the story to unfold. He dressed quickly and hurried to Henry's office. Surely the boss would accept his tardiness when James told him the reason. But Henry was late that day, so he didn't even have to explain himself. James was hurrying to the store to buy milk, and the next morning, when a man called out to him, he turned around slowly and met his gaze with the familiar hazel eyes. In front of him was a man in a stylish leather jacket. The girl's father, who had somehow ended up in the water that day. "I finally found you," the man smiled, holding out his hand to James. "It wasn't easy. My name is Bob. I'm the father of the teenager you rescued." "Hello," James muttered. He knew the man wanted to thank him. James was anxious to know what had happened to the girl, what her condition was now, how she had gotten into the water. All these days the man thought a lot about the rescued girl. I wanted to believe that she was okay. Thanks to social media, the man continued. One of the people who were on the embankment at the time posted a video. "This video clearly shows you saving my Tara. A brave thing to do. desperate. There aren't many people like you these days, and how lucky you were there when you did. How's the girl? James asked. Thera's fine. She's in rehab right now, Bob said. So she's physically hurt? Not really. Just a little cold. That's the other thing. Do you know how she ended up in the river? Did you see that moment? James shook his head no. All because of unrequited love. She fell in love with some boy, and he started dating someone else. Tara got herself worked up, that's all. She's in counseling now. She's under observation, and she's on the mend. In fact, as it turns out, she realized right away what a stupid thing she'd done. Right after she got in the icy water. It was too late if it hadn't been for you. The important thing is that everything's okay now, James smiled. That's true. Her impulse was accidental. I think this situation taught your girl a lot. It taught me a lot, Bob admitted. For years in business, I thought there were no good, selfless people who would do what you do. I became cynical, cold, callous. Your act taught me a lot and made me rethink all my values. I've changed a lot. James nodded. What can I say? I want to thank you. I have opportunities. I know you live in a hostel. You don't have your own place. Ask for anything you want, anything at all. People like you deserve a better fate. James thought for a moment. He remembered Henry's worried eyes when he received his notice from the guardianship authorities, and he remembered little Louis talking excitedly about his dream of becoming an artist. My life suits me just fine, James said at last. But there is one person, a little person, who could use your help. He smiled and spread his arms out to catch the boy, hugging him as he liked. I won first place in the town drawing contest with my drawing of space. Remember I showed it to you? Of course I remember. I told you this would happen, Henry answered. They agreed to go for a walk in the park that Sunday afternoon. Louis liked to run along the paved paths, feed the ducks in the pond, and watch the funny girls. And James and Henry liked to sit at the local cafe, where they cooked flavorful, melt-in-your-mouth kebabs. A little over a year had passed since that conversation with Bob. The wealthy businessman had been amazed at James's request. After all, he had not asked for himself but wanted to help his friend with a small child, two people in desperate straits. Bob bought Henry a one-room apartment, but in a new building in a good neighborhood, near the gymnasium and, importantly, the art school. Henry enrolled Louis in it at the first opportunity. From then on, the boy's talent developed rapidly. His drawings became more and more professional and correct, but at the same time did not lose their uniqueness and spontaneity. Of course, Bob could not help but do something for James personally, although he did not ask him to do so. First, the businessman bought an apartment next to Henry and Louis. They became neighbors, not hostile tenants. Secondly, Bob gave his daughter's savior a high-paying job as a gardener. James had always enjoyed tinkering in the ground, tending to the plants. This was where he belonged. Tara, Bob's daughter, shunned the new gardener for some reason. She was probably afraid of the memories of him. But then they became friends. The girl, as it turned out, regretted her action and now, after a while, could not explain even to herself how she had dared to do such a thing. Sometimes James looked at the tall, thin, touching Thera, and his heart sank at the thought of what would have happened if he hadn't pulled her out of the water. Henry and James walked slowly down the parkway. Ahead of them on his scooter rolled a happy Louis. "Oh, there you are. I thought you were waiting for me at the fountain." James turned around, smiled, and hurried toward Olivia, a short woman with piercing blue eyes. They had only met recently, but it was already clear that they were serious. Today they'd agreed to go out for a fun, boisterous group of people. It was going to be a wonderful day.